Welcome to the History Reviewed channel, where we analyze the lies and deceptions of history. Today we're going to take a closer look at secrecy and military secrecy and how things work. Because as I mentioned in my last video, there's a lot of psychological warfare. And as you will see in some of the other videos that I'm going to do, even though they're about politics, we will end up discussing psychological warfare yet again. Because you will find that it exists everywhere, in more things than you can believe. For much of my life, starting in my early teenage years, I became very interested in UFOs, aliens, flying saucers. I loved that stuff, man. And it drew me like a moth to a flame. And I bought lots of books, and I read up everything that I could about them, and I was fascinated by the subject. The idea of aliens visiting Earth enthralled me. The idea of space travel enthralled me. When I was a teenager, my hobby was astronomy. I liked astronomy. I studied astronomy as much as I could, and it was a very fascinating subject for me. For much of my life, this was one of my pet topics. But as I grew older, and I learned more things and experienced more things in the real world, I began to see this whole subject in a more and more different light. I began to realize over time that there is a bigger and bigger military dimension to the issue of UFOs. I hope you'll have a good close look at some of that film footage that I put in the intro. We'll get back to that film footage later on. At the end of the video that you're going to see, we're going to sit back and analyze in a lot of detail many aspects of all these different things. And some of that film footage right at the beginning, there's some comments I'd like to make about it, and I want to give you some food for thought. As I mentioned in my last video, it appears to me that America is a society that hasn't really experienced militarization in the way that many other nations have, like the Europeans, and like those of us here in Southern Africa, where we've had wars on our doorstep, and many people have been called up, sometimes for years, and they are in the military, and they see things, and all sorts of strange things happen. In many ways, Americans are distant from the concept of war, because war has not come to America's shores since the Civil War, which is now about 150 years ago. So Americans aren't used to actual warfare right on their doorstep. 9/11 was the closest to something like that. But that was just one event. It wasn't a full-scale war. And whatever war came out of that occurred outside of America. So I'd like to spend a bit of time just talking about military secrecy. And I'll tell you my own personal experience with it. I came to South Africa in 1981. In 1980, the communist Robert Mugabe took over in Zimbabwe. My father passed away that year. I was 17 years old, and our family decided that it's time to get out of Zimbabwe. So I was the first one to come to South Africa. Now, at the time, South Africa was already busy with its own wars. And the South Africans had a contract system whereby Rhodesian soldiers could come and join the South African army. So they set up a special short-term contract that lasted for a year that was open to Rhodesians. So my family suggested that I try and get into the South African military, as it would be a way of getting a job and getting into South Africa. So I went through the application process, and initially my brother had suggested to me that I should try and get into the South African Air Force. But the Boer colonel who was interviewing me suggested that I should join the South African Navy because the Navy was the most English of the three military forces. In South Africa, the Army and the Air Force were very Afrikaans, but there was a lot more English-speaking people in the Navy, and the colonel thought I would fit in better there. So to me it didn't really matter because I just wanted a job and I just wanted to get going. And that is how I ended up in the South African Navy. So I came to Pretoria, and that is where I was stationed initially. Then we went for our basic training in Saldanha, and then we went back to Pretoria. I spent just over 2 years in the South African Navy, but I was stationed in Pretoria all the time, and I was just doing clerical work. Towards the end of my time there, in some parts of the military, like the personnel division, for example, Army, Navy, and Air Force all worked together. So for much of the time, the places where I was stationed, there were all three services working there. But towards the end of my time in the Navy, a number of us guys who were in the Navy were transferred to Naval HQ. The South African Navy is not very big. The entire Navy, from the commanding officers down to the rank and file, the people on the bottom, was no more than about 10,000 people. And just to put that in perspective, those of you who are outside of Africa, you're not aware sometimes of how small our organizations were and how few of us there really were. In the case of the Rhodesian Air Force, for example, the entire Rhodesian Air Force, from the pilots down to the ground personnel, was no more than about 1,000 people. And the Rhodesian Army was no more than 28,000. So that'll give you an idea of the small scale on which we operated. But in South Africa, the Air Force was much bigger. I'm guessing that the Air Force maybe had about 100,000 personnel, and the Army definitely ran into the lower hundreds of thousands. But the Navy in South African terms was pretty small. So the Naval HQ was a little building of about 5 or 6 stories in the center of Pretoria. Now, Pretoria being the capital, there were a lot of military buildings there. A lot of buildings that look like civilian buildings actually had military personnel in them. And I worked in one of those buildings until I was transferred to Naval HQ. And next to Pretoria is a military city called Voortrekkerhoogte, and we lived in Voortrekkerhoogte. So Naval HQ was not very imposing, and to normal people just walking past it, they wouldn't even know it's the Naval HQ because there's nothing that said that this is the Naval HQ. But they would see a lot of Navy officers and Navy personnel in their uniforms walking in and out of this little building. When I was in Naval HQ, I was given the task of delivering secret and top secret files. To me, it was just another boring clerical job, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. But it did give me some insight into how things worked, and that's what I'd like to pass on to you, because we're going to get more into this whole topic of secrecy, how things work, etc., etc. You'll also see that there's a slide that I'll insert here where you'll see the classifications as they are in the U.S. Department of Energy. You'll see that it is confidential, secret, and top secret. And that is the basic method that applied in the South African military as well. Most of the files we dealt with were confidential, but then there were the secret files, and then there were the top secret files. So the way things worked, in Naval HQ, they had a room that was a safe, and they'd lock it at night, and all the secret and top secret files would be inside it. Then in the morning, my job would be to go and to start drawing files that various naval officers requested. The files would have a number, and they'd have a subject. So I'd have to go and find the file, draw the file, and then there was a chain of custody. So once the files had been drawn, you would have to sign for them with a date and a time, and then you'd have to take it to the military officer who requested it, and he would have to sign for it with a date and a time. And we'd all be keeping records of who signed for what. So at any point in time, if they wanted to know who had handed the file to whom and who had had it for how long, there'd be a way of knowing all that. Now this, of course, was happening in 1982. And back then, I don't recall ever working on a computer. Everything I did was manual. There were probably computers in other parts of the military, but for our work, it was mostly clerical and manual. Then at the end of the day, I'd have to go and pick up all the files that had been left with these officers, because they're not allowed to keep them, they're not allowed to take them home, they're not allowed to lie around on their desks. So I'd have to go pick up the files, go through the whole signing process again, take them back to the safe, sign them in, and then they can close the safe. I was one of a number of guys who did this kind of work. Now the top secret files, as best I can remember, were placed inside government envelopes. So the file would be placed inside an envelope on which itself was a list that could be signed so that you could see who had it, but it was put in an envelope and stapled shut. And this was the procedure. Whenever the envelope was given to someone, they could open it, work on it, but they'd have to staple it shut and hand it back to you. So that way things don't fall out of it and people don't get to see the contents accidentally and all that. So while I was doing this work, I began to become curious about the contents of a top secret file. And one day, I began to think that I'd like to take a peek. So I thought through a plan of how I could get a few minutes where nobody would see me, and I would open up some of these files. So one day I had 4 files that looked quite interesting. And I grabbed a stapler and I decided I'm going to go and sneak a peek at what's inside. So off I went, and I opened the 4 files, and I had a quick look through them. Probably spent about 15 minutes looking at them. And 3 of the 4 files were pretty boring. After I'd opened them and I looked around, I saw there was nothing really that interested me. The 4th file was quite interesting, and I must have spent about 15 minutes reading it. And what's inside these files are signals from other units. There are signals from other units that contain details and orders and all kinds of things. There are memos, there are letters, sometimes handwritten notes, because a number of different military officers might be working on the same topic. And so each one will be adding to this file depending on what he's doing. So I spent about 15 minutes looking at these files. I stapled them shut and then I delivered them. But those 15 minutes were enough to put me off the idea of ever being curious again. So I found myself with a much reduced curiosity regarding these files. And for the rest of the time that I was there, I never bothered to go through that exercise again. But it was enough for me to at least come to the conclusion that there wasn't much of interest unless you have something very specific you want to do. The one thing that came home to me from my experience in the military was that the military is very pedantic when it gets to things being hidden away. They would rather err on the side of caution and rather overclassify things than underclassify them. I remember in my earlier work that we sometimes stumbled across secret files, and when we looked at their contents, we couldn't believe that somebody had classified this as secret, because we certainly didn't think there was anything that important in it that it needed to be classified as secret. Anyhow, that gives you a bit of an overview of how this process worked then. And I'm sure that the process in its basic form is the same one that everybody else uses. It's just more sophisticated now, and it's probably all the security and the auditing is done by computers, and you probably just access files via servers and things and so forth. But in those days it was manual, and there was that whole aspect to it. One of the guys who worked with us, another young Boer guy, he had the task of delivering top secret files to different buildings and to different units. So he spent his time driving around Pretoria, going and hand delivering these top secret files. And I just want to give you a little bit of insight into the military and their security. There are rules regarding what you have to do. And the military is in total control of your life. When you are there, you belong to them. And you have to do what they tell you to do. There's no such thing as insubordination there. If you try that kind of stuff, they'll put you in your place very fast, and they have total control over the procedure. So your commanding officers tell you exactly what you are and aren't allowed to do, and there's all kinds of warnings, and people are made to sign things and so forth. The signing process is not really a key issue, because whether you do or don't sign it, you can still get into trouble. But they make you sign things so that you are fully aware that you know the rules. Now this one young Afrikaner, he was known for his bad attitude. And one day he was behind on his work, and he couldn't get to doing all the deliveries he wanted to do. And he later told us that he decided to take some of these top secret files, chuck them into government envelopes, and he posted them at the post office. Well, when he told that to the rest of us, we thought he was insane, because that is definitely not allowed, and our military officers would have done their nut if they'd known about it. He would have been in the biggest trouble of his life. Amazingly enough, he chucked these top secret files into government envelopes, addressed them to the various units, and it seems nobody complained about receiving top secret files in the post, or they didn't know who to blame or whatever. I don't know how he got away with it, but the rest of us, I can tell you, for months thereafter, we couldn't stop laughing at what this guy had done. We thought he was absolutely nuts. But the fact that he got away with it was probably the cherry on the cake. Apart from that instance, I didn't know of anybody who did anything even close to that. Everybody else did what they were told. Now, the video that I'm going to show you is a National Geographic video that came out a few years ago. This is one of the most important documentaries I've ever come across. And this thing is jam-packed with information. However, there's a lot in it that I want to discuss, and it's best if I discuss it after the video. So what I've done is that I've marked a number of places inside the video. There are about a dozen different places where a red screen will pop up, and I'd like you to focus very closely for the next half a minute to a minute on everything that follows that red slide that's popped up. And there's one slide where I'll give you double warning, because that is the most important part of this video. Much of what's in here I've never seen on other documentaries before. But the one where I give you the double warning, that's the one that we're going to spend a lot of time looking at really closely, because it's something I always suspected existed in America. But every single American I spoke to, nobody ever came out and told me exactly about this. But I suspected enough from our experience here that such a thing must exist there. In British-created countries, like these countries in Africa that were once a part of the British Empire, we all inherited a concept called the Official Secrets Act. The American one has got a different name, but it's very interesting what it is and how it works. In this documentary, you will see how quickly and in a very slick manner they can come and shut up everybody and make sure that everybody doesn't say a word, even if you are a civilian. They will shut you up, and thereafter you too will tell whatever lies you need to tell in order to keep the secret a secret. You'll also see in here that a secret is treated much more firmly than you can believe. So you can't go to the military and say to them, "Oh, is that a secret thing over there?" If it's a secret thing, they can never say, "Oh yes, we have this secret thing over here." That is already way too much. So a secret is a secret, which means you cannot even admit that there is a secret to begin with. The people that you will see in here, I know that this story was printed in various other places on the internet. These same people were interviewed afterwards. You are about to see what Americans were working on more than 50 years ago. And it will give you an idea of how far ahead of their time they were. And you also will be finding yourself asking the question, if that's what they were doing 50 years ago, what are they busy doing now? This documentary is just over 50 minutes long. Watch it, and then afterwards I'll go through all the different points. There is a lot to discuss about this.
I was the commander of Area 51.
All lives had never worked up there.
It's the most famous secret military base in the world.
We did accept these conditions. Keep your mouth shut. Your lives or other lives depend on it.
Now the men who worked at Area 51 tell their stories for the first time.
lot of misinformation, but it's been fed by people's natural curiosity. If you don't know what's going on, you might like to find out.
The agency has never and will never ever admit there is an Area 51 in the story.
Established by the CIA in 1955 to develop and test America's most secret military projects, Area 51 was named after a grid number on a map. While officially it doesn't exist, today satellite images of the Nevada desert show 7 runways and more than 25 hangars. Shrouded in secrecy, access has always been highly restricted. But finally, the early programs that started it all are being declassified, and memories can be brought to light.
It was a real Cold War. You're talking nuclear bombs aimed at every major city, and it's like 2 people. Who's going to throw the first punch?
There are a lot of times when democracy just has to give way to strict control like military so you can accomplish something that will allow for your country to survive. And that's the way we all thought about it, I think.
We had a meeting. No pencil or paper was allowed. Even the pilots did not talk to each other because nothing was written down. It's all in our heads.
When we came into the program, we were given a code name. My first name was Ken, and the last name started with C for Collins, but it was Colmar, C-O-L-M-A-R.
At least with me, I'm not that curious, which I felt was good on the secrecy part of it. I mean, if I don't need to know it, I'm not going to ask.
I was told, don't bother ever trying to find your level of clearance. You've just been cleared by the highest groups in Washington, D.C. They have an apparatus to know what you're doing, what you're saying, where you're going.
The base was built around a dry lake bed known as Groom Lake. It offered obvious advantages.
Well, we needed a good place to land, that we could land any direction depending on where the wind came from, and the round lake served that purpose. It was also protected, the mountain range around it, so it wasn't very visible. Smooth as glass. Just unbelievable. I could take that staff car out there as fast as it'd go, and it wouldn't even make a bump. It's just beautiful.
Groom Lake was very sparse, very sparse. We had a bunch of trailers for us to live in. Then we had a all-purpose building where you eat. Didn't have TV, didn't even have a radio.
We didn't have any women. There was one woman who was with the finance of CIA that came up there and spent one night. That's the only one I ever knew of.
The Paradise Ranch was the first name that was given to the establishment. They thought it would soften the blow of the austerity. It was an attempt to perhaps convince people it wasn't quite as bad as it looked.
I think the charm of Area 51 is it just had one job to do. And anybody that wasn't needed didn't go there, probably didn't want to go there. Because, you know, it wasn't that grand a vacation spot. Pretty tough duty.
The CIA needed a certain kind of man to work at Area 51.
But we kind of self-selected to be quiet warriors. The security screening and it eliminate a fair number of people who were kind of show-offs.
I was in for my first secrecy clearance, and I went to a movie while my wife went shopping with my mother. I'm in the middle of the movie. In walks this lady, a young girl about my age. And in the middle of the movie, asked me if I live in Vegas, how long I've been in Vegas, and what do I do? She didn't like my answers. Within a half an hour, she got up and left. And I often thought, how long had she been following me? Or was she following me, or was she just one of the Las Vegas girls looking for a customer? I'll never know.
We were not told what it was going to be. We had no idea.
We were just told it is extremely sensitive and it's not to be discussed with anybody.
Interviews were conducted in hotel rooms.
This guy had passed everything. So then they asked him, we got a black project back west we'd like for you to work on. Would you be interested? You asked, well, I need to run that by my wife. He said, okay, do that. When he got back to the motel room, they were gone. They'd packed it and left. He never saw them again. The fact that he had asked his wife whether or not he could work on a secret project killed him right there. He was not invited back.
Area 51 was created for one top-secret project called Aquatone. In 1955, men from the CIA, the Air Force, and a secret division of Lockheed came to Paradise Ranch to begin work.
All they would tell us, you really were going to volunteer for a pig in a poke. And most of the people didn't take it, but I did. And we knew we had to go for pressure suit, so we knew it was going to be high altitude stuff. Your blood boils above 50,000 without having pressurization. So if you were to lose pressurization, just your engine count, you're above 50, that suit saves you. They selected a manufacturer in Boston that made the suits up to order. They had to be tailor-made, skin tight. So we went to David Clark, who made brassieres for Sears, I remember.
We were fitted, came home, and we went back and fitted again after it was made. Couldn't tell them, you know, who we were or what we were doing. Just, we need a pressure suit.
Ounce, even wheels, could limit the U-2's ability to fly high.
You got all your fuel in the wing. There's no way you're going to keep that tip off the ground. So they were only there to keep the wings off the ground. And as soon as the wings lifted up, those would drop out. I used to like to take off, just spiral right up straight.
The government's cover story for the U-2 was that it was being used for weather research.
That was our cover story. Yeah, reconnaissance weather squadron.
If not conventional aircraft then, what did they see?
The U-2 cruised at 3 times the height of regular airliners and would sometimes be glimpsed by civilians.
I can't be sure, but I believe I saw the sun glinting off her windows or observation portholes of sort.
In the mid-1950s, while both the Cold War and America's interest in UFOs were at their peak,
I think it was from outer space, but friendly.
the silver-colored plane sometimes created confusion.
It was pure aluminum, and we said, hey, we look like a bright star up there.
Pilots were told to deny everything, even to aircraft controllers.
There are stories about seeing something flying way above. They may have called it in, but they'll still get nothing other than evasive stuff.
If you get up along the Canadian border, the ground controller wanted to question my altitude. Actually, he was pretty accurate. And I says, no, you gotta recalibrate your weapon. That's not the altitude we're at.
By 1957, unacknowledged U-2 flights were the source of half of all reported UFO sightings. But they were nothing compared to what would come. Area 51 was so remote, most workers commuted weekly from Burbank or Las Vegas.
Usually, the family was asleep when I got up. Monday morning, you'd get up and drive. You got there early enough to get the airplane, and they usually left about 8 o'clock.
We never even knew how we were going to get out there. We often joke, one week they're flying with bombs, next week they're flying with chickens. You never knew what was in the cargo bay of that plane that you were hitching a ride on.
When you got off the Lockheed Constellation, you went through security and they checked you had to have your badge and make sure that you're the right guy coming in, and they did that routinely. They had very, very good security.
Jim Freedman commuted daily.
I had 3 children, and the typical, what does your dad do? At school, I told them, I repair televisions. And my wife, she was so busy raising the children and getting them ready for school that she really wasn't that interested, because she knew I played around with television a lot.
It was fun. We had a good life. Even though sometimes he didn't come home for maybe a week, but he called, you know, and I said Daddy had to work overtime. The kids, especially my daughter, she says, "Where's Daddy? He had to work overtime." Oh, so I didn't know what he did.
It's a strange daily routine. You go home at night, and the wife says, "How did your day go today?" And you're non-committal. It wasn't bad. I got a few TVs fixed. I mean, no one is going to say, "Oh, honey, we just got the radar cross-section of the most secret aircraft in the world down to a gnat's behind." Yeah, right. Sure, now what did you do today? Nothing. You can't even talk about it.
Let us face, without panic, the reality of our times. The fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities.
This insistence on total secrecy was fueled by Cold War paranoia and the widespread fear that the Soviet Union might destroy the United States.
Each side was suspicious of the other, and they were afraid they were going to be wiped out by a nuclear first strike.
No one was trusted, not even the test pilots at Area 51. In 1963, Ken Collins crashed his plane on a training mission.
Probably a week later, they said, "Well, okay, would you agree to be hypnotized so we can establish whether or not they may have forgotten something?" I said, "Absolutely." So they got this, my term, high-powered shrink from Boston come out. But he couldn't hypnotize me. They just sort of sit there like, you know, he was talking to me like you were, and I thought, I'm just still just as like I'm always been, and he just couldn't do it. It just didn't happen. A few days later, Lockheed's flight surgeon called me up and he says, "Well, would you agree to have sodium pentothal?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'd be happy to do that." I told my wife, I said, "Well, I'm going down to Lockheed. I have to go to work." She said, "This is Sunday. You never go to work on Sunday." And I said, "Well, this is special." And she said, "Okay." About 6 o'clock that night, these guys bring me home. Well, I'm still under the influence of the sodium pentothal. And they tore me in the chair in the living room and said goodbye and walked out. That's all they said. My wife, I didn't say a word to her. Said, "Your car's here," gives the keys. And she was sort of irritated because she thought I was out drinking with the guys. But all in all, at the end of it, it established that what I said was everything that I'd told them was factual.
When such a bomb bursts at or near the ground, tens of thousands of tons...
The government raced to develop ever more powerful weapons, and it chose to put its secret base, Area 51, alongside its nuclear testing grounds.
Put on your gun.
It was smack dab in the middle of the nuclear test facility area up in Nevada. And nobody was anxious to go out there. And I think that privacy was very important to getting the job done. And and doing so in a good deal of secrecy.
But with more than 450 nuclear explosions taking place between 1955 and 1968, the location had its drawbacks.
When they were firing nuclear explosions there, of course, we're always notified and we had to evacuate. One time, it took almost 2 weeks because of weather, mostly winds and all that being wrong.
And we had to wear radiation badges to make sure we were still clean. I was standing out on the runway for some reason, and there was a blast coming off in Yucca Flats. And I actually saw a wave pattern in the ground coming towards me. It actually went up and down, up and down. This was an underground explosion. It's just unbelievable that these big circles would actually drop down on the ground.
Driven by Cold War pressures, the U.S. worried that Area 51's founding project, the U-2, was already becoming vulnerable to Soviet missiles.
The plan was to have a manned aircraft successor to the U-2 with far less vulnerability and with greater capability. Very few people at the agency at CIA knew about it.
In the late 1950s, Area 51 had a new top-secret project.
I started in 1958 working on what was called ox cart.
About 1960, I was notified that I had been selected for some kind of astronaut program.
It was an aircraft that we proposed to the CIA that would fly at very high altitudes, about 17 miles up. The original intent was to make it go as fast and as high as we could make it, and as difficult for radars to detect as possible. We were going so fast. If you're in California, you're flying north-south, and you're making a turn at speed, at altitude, you won't stay in the state of California. It was that fast that just brought you out.
In the Cold War, information was as powerful as weapons. The ox cart was designed to be America's ultimate spy tool, the world's first stealth plane. It flew fast and high enough to outrun missiles. Thousands labored on the plane inside Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. But despite the scale of production, the project remained secret.
The ox cart clearance was specialty clearance of its own, and it was about as high as you could get.
The aircraft had to have the ability to withstand temperatures caused by air friction flying through the atmosphere at 2,000 miles an hour.
The ox cart, 93% was titanium, a material that no one had ever made an airplane of. If you want a lot of titanium, you make a deal with the Soviet Union.
How the CIA got that stuff out of Russia, as far as I know, is still secret today. I don't know how they did it. I don't know who did it. But we did get titanium material that we needed.
When the ox cart prototype was ready, the government needed to move it to Area 51 from its production line in California.
If it was round, they would put it in a square box. If it was square, they'd put it in a round box.
It was too long, and the wings were too broad, so the sections were separated and hauled all the way from Burbank to the Groom Lake side.
You don't want a wide trailer going down a busy highway. So you would do this surreptitiously when no one's around.
It required cooperation from California Highway Patrol and Nevada Highway Patrol, the CIA, and I have no idea how many others. The path up there had to be cleared. They had to cut trees away, regrade the dirt on the sides of the freeway so that they could clear the boxes. They didn't have to know what's in the boxes, but they had to know it was something that had to be protected and kept secret. So it was a rather enormous operation just to get them up there to the Groom Lake facility.
Ken Collins was one of the first pilots to see the ox cart after it arrived at Area 51.
I went up to the area, the operations officer up there said, would you like to see what you're going to fly? I said, absolutely. And we walked over to the hangar, and windows up top were just the only place that emitted any light. You could see back in the shadows this long, beautiful airplane. Just amazing. First thing you'd think was a spaceship.
Inside Area 51, nearly 2,000 workers had a single goal: to complete the ultimate black project.
There's a lot of things that people really don't need to know. And this is why Area 51 is such a mythical situation, because they don't know what's going on.
Area 51 just had one purpose, and that was to get Oxcart through development and into operation overseas.
Much about Oxcart has been classified for decades. More is known about its successor, the iconic SR71 Blackbird. But today, glimpses of Oxcart are finally coming to light. Oxcart was the world's first stealth plane, designed to be nearly impossible for enemies to detect on radar.
The test that I was involved in involved an Oxcart flying over a radar station. And the basic idea was to find out if they could fly over without being detected. I went into the radar control building to watch what would happen when the thing went over. Well, I was standing there and nobody could see much happening. All of a sudden, it sounded like a ladder or something fell over on the roof. What it was a shock wave from the airplane. They had not seen it on the radars. The it certainly seemed like it was doing its job.
The ox cart could fly coast to coast in 70 minutes, but its sole purpose was to spy. These images, taken over North Korea, were released by the CIA and have never been seen publicly. They reveal how well the ox cart could photograph objects on the ground from 90,000 feet, while traveling 2,200 miles an hour.
This camera was going in an airplane that was going to be going at Mach 3. The resolution was 12 inches, that's 1 foot. If you think about an object on the ground and put a grid on it with 12-inch squares, a little bit like linoleum squares, and each one of those squares is either black or white or gray. An object that was 12 inches on a side could be clearly identified as an object, although you couldn't tell what its internal structure was. But if you're taking a picture of a tank, you probably get, 500 knots, and that pretty well defines the tank.
But at the height of the Cold War, the men at Area 51 weren't the only ones with powerful cameras.
The Russians had anywhere from 4 to 6 what we called ash cans.
We had a satellite tracking setup, and we were alerted to the time when the satellite was supposed to pass over.
So as they were approaching our area, we would shut everything down.
We had hood screwed sheds, we call them. And if a plane happened to be out in the open while the satellite was coming over the horizon, they would screw it into that building.
But workers sometimes needed to leave a model of the ox cart on a pylon so they could test its stealth properties. And with the Soviets spying from above, this presented a problem.
If you had a plane up in a pylon, it was pretty hard to disguise it from satellites. There were people in the security department that felt that we couldn't let them have a peek.
So we had no way of handling the situation but taking the mock-up down off of the pole, putting it away in a hangar, and then taking it back out and putting it back up.
That made the job very difficult, very difficult. To start working on the aircraft and then have to run it back into the hangar. And then pull it out, and then put it in, and then pull it out. It gets to be quite a hassle.
Despite efforts to hide the secret aircraft, intelligence agents discovered that the Soviet Union had a drawing of the plane and had found a way to detect ox cart.
Most of the testing that we did in the daylight, radiation from the sun would heat up everything except the shadow. If we left the mock-up stationary for a half an hour or so, it might leave a shadow that an infrared camera could pick up.
Soon, the men at Area 51 were intentionally devising fakes for the Soviets to discover.
We used the infrared satellites for coming over, and we would draw the outline of some kind of exotic plane in front of one of the hangars. Most of them was out of cardboard. Just before the satellite got there, we'd have a couple heaters in the rear end of it to make it receive a heat signature as though the plane had just landed. We always wanted them to think we had something that they didn't. And they would sure spend a lot of time and money to try to figure out what it was.
In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen.
Deceptions designed to protect Oxcart fueled the rumors about Area 51.
Air Force jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope.
We flew 2,850 missions out of Groom Lake, Area 51, that no one knew about. The plane did not exist. And naturally, the sunlight is right. It would be spotted, and it would become a genuine UFO sighting.
General Sanford, Air Force Intelligence Director, confirms that the objects are not secret American weapons and reiterates the Air Force's obligation to investigate.
This is during the era that the Air Force was doing Project Blue Book, investigating UFO sightings. They started investigating, and all of a sudden they'd run up there against this wall of security. I said, whoa, that's a top secret mission. You got to make a cover story and forget it happened.
We have received and analyzed between 1 and 2,000 reports.
So, Project Blue Book, the poor guys, they would have to manufacture a story to explain that sighting.
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin.
Air traffic controllers at the FAA had to be cautioned not to report something moving that fast in American airspace for fear of alarming people.
Airline pilots were a big troublemaker. They would see that Blackbird climbing. They'd be at 80,000 feet and the airlines were at 45. And they would call down and say, you know, they'd be yelling over the air. But they'd see them, and the passengers would see them. The FBI would meet them at whatever airport they were landing at, and they just make them sign an inadvertent exposure that they wouldn't reveal what they had just seen.
But when things went disastrously wrong at Area 51, the cover-up machine went into high gear. Despite the secrecy surrounding the Oxcart, clues from an early mishap are finally coming to light decades later.
It was low altitude, a subsonic engine test. We had problems with getting the engine to accelerate out to Mach 3. We flew north out of the area and got up to 25,000 feet, headed south, and we started getting into the weather. Something just wasn't feeling right. It was losing airspeed, but it wasn't indicated. Pretty soon, the airplane pitched up, went up, got inverted, and went into a flat and simple spin. You just can't recover it. So I thought I better eject. So I ejected down, because I was upside down.
Ken made the right decision and punched out.
What entered my mind then was I hate like hell to, have to bail out of that good airplane.
He landed somewhere out near Wendover, Utah.
I landed and collapsed the chute. I figured I was going to need that because I was going to probably be out there overnight for survival, and I would use that to sleep in. My checklist had come apart, and I'm starting to look and picking up some of the pages. They're all classified, that are stamped secret. The papers that I had picked up, I just stuck in my pocket, I guess. When a pickup truck come bouncing over across the desert, 3 guys were in the truck. Well, I was amazed to see them. They said, hey, come on, get in there. We'll take you over to your airplane. And I said, no, that's an F-105, and that was our story that we had. I said, it's got a nuclear weapon on board. They said, you better get in here. We're leaving. We're not going to stay. So I jumped in front with them. In the front, there's 4 of us in the cab. I don't know where they thought they were going to go if a bomb went off, you know. It's probably close enough, it wouldn't have made any difference.
After Collins' admonition, after his white lie, I don't think they were very anxious to go take a hard look at it.
We did have a phone number that we'd call, you know, emergency kind of thing, and I made a 10-cent call and identified myself, and that's all they needed to know, and I told them where I was.
That gave the agency about 2 days to go out and scrape up the pieces and clean up the mess. Otherwise, it might have been a county fair.
This is the first time photos of the government's effort to sanitize the crash scene have been revealed.
Well, they had 2 of our survival guys that were part of the security team, and later on they got on 2 horseback, and they'd go back and forth and sort of plowshare to see if they got anything that was left laying there that was classified.
Between the cover story and the remote location, the cleanup was good enough to keep the crash site secret for decades.
It was described as having been an F-105 crash. You know, planes crash all the time. We're on military bases. It went away.
50 years later, aerospace historian Peter Merlin has found the crash site the government tried to erase from history.
Now we're getting into the real debris field. As part of the effort to sanitize the crash site, the larger pieces were cut up with a blowtorch and flown to Area 51 in a big cargo plane.
He searched the desert for years using information from declassified documents.
This secret memorandum was declassified by the CIA. It says all traces of 123 have been removed from the crash scene. My experience with crash sites, however, is that there's always something left. This piece here is part of the wing structure. The A was for the A-12, W for wing, and 667 was the drawing number. This one's from the interior of the cockpit. Skunk Works inspection stamp. This is the impact crater. There's titanium all over the place. Whoa, here's a big chunk. This is some thick titanium. Right here is where the aft fuselage struck the ground. On either side, you'll find a depression from the engine nacelles. There's one right here. We're standing in the middle of an engine nacelle depression. This would be similar to what would happen today if a secret aircraft from Area 51 were to be lost off range. They would probably implement the same kind of security restrictions. They would also use a cover story.
Airport, Las Vegas, present day. A private hangar for unmarked jets. Every weekday, workers continue to make the same commute to Area 51 that's taken place since the days of the U-2 and Oxcart. These early programs changed Area 51 into a permanent home for America's black projects.
But you go back and look at all the records. There's never been a flight at Groom Lake. Nothing that was as it seems.
And the mystery continues today. The annual black military budget is more than $50 billion, the highest level in history. But even those who once sacrificed so much for Area 51 are no longer in on the secrets.
I wish I knew what they were doing, but I don't know. I've even heard that Area 51 is a cover story for a much more secret area. I don't know, I can't confirm that either. I have no idea. I wish I knew.
The secrecy and cover-ups continue to fuel rumors.
There are a lot of situations people cannot know that they're not true. So I think that there's been an awful lot of misinformation, but it's been fed by people's natural curiosity. If you don't know what's going on, you might like to find out.
Often, even the wildest speculation contains threads of truth.
They have all these underground chambers they claim we got out there, and tunnels that reach all the way to Las Vegas. And this, absolutely nothing like that. At the nuclear test stand, we did go underground because above ground it was radioactive. But nothing at the area. And the myth has been in recent years that we have gained all this speed and technology out of the reverse engineering alien craft. This is the true story. We did reverse engineer things out there. It was a Russian MiG-21. And we got it in 1968, and we tore it apart to see how the Russians built it, and then put it back together, and we flew it.
Even the conspiracy theory that the government staged the moon landing at Area 51 has a slight basis in fact.
It was on the atomic testing grounds. We tested our land rover that we sent to the moon. We tested all of the life support systems. The astronauts came out here and trained the atomic bomb craters. So that's probably where some of those crazy stories come from.
I think when people signed on to Oxcart or U2, they agreed that it might never be revealed. And so people said, hey, look, it's kind of a family secret. We're happy to go to the grave with it.
It was an honor, very much an honor to have a job with that much trust put in me as I'd say a country boy. A lot of trust was put on people like me that worked out there. A lot of people dedicated their lives. Some families broke up because They never knew what their husbands, if their husbands were going to come home at night. It wasn't just a job.
We were given some task to accomplish, and we believed in it, and we did the best we could. I'm just glad it turned out the way it did.
But when it comes to what went on at Area 51, the only thing we know for sure is that we'll never know everything.
I'm telling you about 5% of what went on.
I hope you enjoyed that and found it interesting. As for me, I absolutely love that name ox cart. I think that is such brilliant military humor, because an ox cart implies it's slow and cumbersome, and this thing was the absolute opposite of that. So I think ox cart is amazing. Now let me go through the video from the beginning. Let me discuss the points in chronological order which I had drawn your attention to. The first one, the commander of Area 51 says there was a real Cold War. It appears to me that nowadays people forget that there was a war after World War II. The Cold War was very much a real war. The fact that it did not break out into open fighting doesn't mean that nothing took place. Those of us who lived in Africa, we were on the receiving end of this Cold War. For us, it was very much a hot war. The Vietnam War, the Korean War, all the liberation wars of Africa, as well as the liberation wars in Latin America and South America, were all a part of this Cold War. The Russians gained a lot of strength out of World War II, including the fact that they had captured German scientists and also German equipment. America and Britain also benefited from it. So at the end of World War II, there was a lot of activity. And the Cold War was very real. The Cold War was a war that was fought across the world. And there were times when planes were even shot down, submarines were sunk, but it was all very hush-hush. On the whole, it was hush-hush. One of the times when it came out and almost became a hot war was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's a lot of things that happen in the Cold War which might not seem real to Americans because it never came to America. But there are people in Europe who could tell you about it because the Warsaw Pact was part of the Russian side and part of the Russian military alliance. And the Warsaw Pact also played their role. So Russia and China and the Warsaw Pact were all involved in communist activity after World War II. And that broke out in lots of wars across the world, because they were trying to gain communist footholds all across the world, and they were hoping to try and turn entire continents into communist nations. And Vietnam and all those things, they're all related. Vietnam, the liberation wars of Africa and South America, it's all the same thing. Cuba, all of that, that was all part of this Cold War. So don't think that the Cold War is just a figment of someone's imagination. And that whole business about spying on Russia is very real. It's something we could go back to and look at again. And of course, Russia was a great beneficiary of World War II because it got all kinds of weaponry and money and things from America and Britain on a vast scale, over and above the thousands of German scientists that they captured and probably put to work working for them. So that explains why Russia sort of exploded with energy after World War II. But the good news is that a lot of that communist explosion of energy from Russia and China has basically gone downhill. And the one nation that they're still trying to build up is China. These are topics for other discussions. The next point, the man tells you that they had a meeting and no pencils or paper were allowed, nothing was to be written down. Very interesting. Shows you how serious they took their work. So regarding Groom Lake, you can see the good reasons why they wanted Groom Lake. They'd found this place with a flat bed. It was circular. A plane in trouble could land on it from any direction. And so clearly Groom Lake was the original attraction. That interesting story that the commander of Area 51 gives about the lady who approaches him when he's busy watching a movie. I have come across references where they say the CIA likes to use women as spies. And women historically do make excellent spies. And they can get information out of men that other men can't get out of men. One comes across the concept of women as good spies often. The story about the man who was interviewed, and then he said he needs to go and talk to his wife about this, that already disqualified him completely from being part of anything that's top secret. And there again you can see how serious this business is. And earlier in the clip you will have heard that the CIA guy was telling you that anybody who's a show-off, they also got rid of them. They didn't like show-offs. They want people who are quiet. In another documentary, I heard some guys talking about secrecy, and they were talking about the concept of telling people that you won't be famous, but you'll be top secret famous. And by that they mean that you'll be famous, but only that select group of people who have the ability to know what you were doing, you'll be famous among them, but it's never going to get further than that. And I suspect that there are lots and lots and lots of top secret famous people operating in many countries. They do work that they can never talk about, and it's known only to very select groups of people. And in America, you also get companies that are contracting to the military and to the government that are doing classified work. The company and all its employees also have to abide by that. So there's a lot of people who may appear to be doing normal work, but actually they do a lot more secret work than you think, but they'll never be able to talk about it. America itself has had many top secret successes, which I think many Americans don't know about. And this whole business of spying on the Soviet Union and the CIA being able to keep track of what is going on there, especially with nuclear weapons, that is one of the great successes of all time. They were able to penetrate Russian airspace, and the Russians themselves didn't have planes that could match the American planes, so they tried to build missile systems that were more powerful than anything else in order to try and shoot these planes down. And it was quite a game that they were playing. But the CIA's aim was that if they had a plane that could fly high enough and fast enough, then they could always stay ahead of the Russians. And that's very interesting. Shows you what they were able to achieve. And the other thing, of course, is that spying is the most secret and most important thing that organizations do. So in the mid-1950s, there was a great UFO craze. What I can't tell you after all these years and all my interest in UFOs, I still can't really come to a conclusion as to where the concept of the UFO really came from. And so many of the books that I thought were reliable ultimately turned out to be rather unreliable. So it's hard to say how the story of UFOs came about and what exactly allowed it to become what it was. But what we can see from this documentary, though, and from what the CIA has declassified, is that secret military programs made use of the UFO concept and the flying saucer concept and the alien concept as a cover story. And if you start looking into secret things, the cover story is the critical part of it. Whenever people are engaged in secret work, they have to have a cover story, a fake reason that is the reason that they give for doing what they are doing. And the cover story is important, and the UFO thing plays well into this cover story. So there's something of a chicken and egg problem here. Which came first? But it seems from these declassified documents that UFO interest was already there. But then these secret military programs also came and provided some of the most, in quotes, concrete evidence for UFOs. And that stirred up the craze a whole lot more, because now there was something more tangible to go after. But the thing that people were thinking was a UFO was not a UFO. In the case of the U-2 plane, because it was made of aluminum, the sun could bounce off of it and people would catch glimpses of this thing. But the key thing here is that the military had something that they had to keep a secret because national survival depends on it. And secrecy is the key to them succeeding. And people's lives depend on it. So for them to go and tell a lie, to work on a lie and to misdirect people, for them that is a small price to pay in order to hide the real thing that they want to hide. And for them, they don't really care whether people believe those alien stories or not. Their goal is to keep people away from the real story. But now there are other games that start coming out of this. And the other games that come out of this is that you can then start using what people believe, and you can do all sorts of other things once you realize that people believe in something. But for the purposes of these guys, they just needed an excuse. They just had to think up an excuse, no matter if it was a bit of a lame excuse, but they had to think up something to stop people asking questions. That's the crux of it here. And these planes were now fueling the interest in UFOs, as well as providing new, quotes, evidence for UFOs, all of which now makes the whole thing a lot worse. So by 1957, half of all UFO sightings were actually sightings of U-2 planes. And that's interesting. Notice that nobody was trusted. There's no such concept as trust. There is only the hard facts of what you can ascertain. And that is how that world is, that world of spying. You can't trust anybody. Anybody can turn out to be an enemy agent. And to me, this just tells you how professional these people were in their work. That they would not trust their own test pilots, they'd put them through routines to check what they were saying, etc. And also in this documentary, make no mistake, certain things have been declassified and these guys are talking about it. I assure you that in this very documentary, if these gentlemen had to lie about other stuff that was not yet declassified, they would do it without batting an eyelid. But even so, the process of declassification allows us to get some kind of window into what was going on, even if it isn't everything that was going on, even if it's just a small part of what was going on. It starts giving you some idea of what they were doing and why they were doing it. For me, one of the most awesome parts of this documentary was the story about Oxcart, the world's first stealth aircraft. Until I saw this documentary, I was under the impression that the F-117 stealth was the world's first stealth aircraft. And here you can see that they had one at least 20 years earlier. Now, regarding stealth aircraft, the F-117, if you look at it, it's a plane made up of very sharp angles. And if you read the story behind it, they'll tell you that it has to do with a Russian who was doing calculations on how to reduce the radar image of a plane. And he had mathematics that worked with triangles. So some guys at Lockheed came across what this Russian had done, and they then did calculations. And they used calculations based on these triangles to arrive at a plane that has got the smallest radar profile. The problem is that a plane with those angular surfaces can't fly because it's not aerodynamic. But by the time they were looking into this in the 1970s, they had computer technology that allowed them to make a plane fly even if the plane is aerodynamically unstable. And so that is how the F-117 stealth plane came into existence. So the F-117 is based on angles and radar reflection. But when you go and look at Oxcart, which was the first stealth plane, that plane was not based on that concept. So it shows you that there are different technologies that allow them to arrive at stealth features. I know that the SR71 Blackbird is supposed to have radar absorbing paints and stuff like that. But all those planes were aerodynamic. So how they arrived at their stealth in the case of that plane is interesting. And it also appears to me that the means by which they arrived at their stealth in that plane in the early 1960s must be completely different and classified to such a degree that the creators of the second stealth plane didn't know the mechanism by which the first plane had been made stealthy. So that is interesting. And who knows how many other methods of stealth there are. I remember reading too that the B-2 bomber, that the flying wing shape is also by its nature quite stealthy. So as you get into this technology, all kinds of weird things now come out, and you can see that for the engineers and the scientists, there must be all kinds of things that they can do that have never been declassified. How they arrive at these things is a whole other story. So it's interesting that when they were building Oxcart, even though lots of people were involved in it, the whole thing remained completely secret. And that again shows you how good their processes are. That all those people working in that factory, that the real information of what this thing was didn't get out. And this brings me back to what I said in my last video. The mass media wants to mislead you into thinking that people can't keep secrets. The reality is, there are two things where the media is completely lying to you. The one is that people can't keep secrets. The other one is that there's no such thing as a conspiracy. If you move out into the world, you'll see there is nothing but conspiracies. There are conspiracies everywhere. They exist in every single business. Friends are busy with little conspiracies, conspiracies to make money, conspiracies to do all sorts of things, little political conspiracies. Most of the conspiracies are actually financial. A guy that I worked with, who later went and joined National Intelligence, he and I had some discussions later, and one of the things that he brought out was that lots of conspiracies that they monitor are actually financial conspiracies. But when the media and the CIA try to kill the concept of conspiracies, they are flying in the face of the normal world. The normal world is filled with conspiracies, even if they're not very complicated conspiracies, but they exist everywhere, and it is normal. And the same is true with secrecy. People keep all kinds of secrets, even personal secrets. But in military and government, more secrets are kept, far more secrets are kept than are let out. These people are much better at keeping secrets than you think. And it is only on the rare occasions when really big things get out that the public as a whole become aware of. But there are lots and lots and lots of things that will never see the light of day. I enjoyed the story of putting square things in a round box and round things in a square box. That sounds very much like the way military people would think. They will do anything to try and hide any kind of clue as to what this thing is. These people took their work seriously. And as you can see, the police and all those other departments worked quite smoothly with them, and they went and they did things at quiet times. They were able to sneak a whole aircraft along public roads and get it to Groom Lake. There you go. That's the kind of stuff military people are doing all the time. These people are not stupid. What I find interesting is that although Oxcart is the precursor to the SR71, it is Oxcart that is actually more classified than the SR71. Of course, how much we actually know about them is another question. But it is interesting that Oxcart itself was so highly classified. You'll find that Oxcart is listed on Wikipedia. It is actually the Lockheed A-12. They don't mention in this program the Lockheed Skunk Works. Skunk Works is the secret part of Lockheed that have been responsible for developing most of the highly classified planes of America since about World War II. And the Skunk Works have developed many aircraft. Oxcart, the U-2, the SR-71, these are just some of the planes. The F-117 stealth fighter, that was another one from the Skunk Works. The Skunk Works are actually amazing in the things that they've been able to do and able to churn out. They've been way ahead of everybody else. What I will tell you is that the Germans don't feature here. And that reason is because the Germans were boycotted by the Americans. I know that after World War II, even in the 1960s, the Germans were already getting ready to start producing some amazing German planes. They had some really wild concepts. But the Americans just killed it dead. And so you don't hear much about the Germans. The Germans have been shoved aside. But make no mistake, the Germans can build all sorts of things, incredible things. And if you get into the German concepts, the things that the Germans were thinking of, the things the Germans were trying to build, the things the Germans did build, it reads like science fiction. The Germans built some of the most incredible planes ever. And that guy that I worked with, who later joined National Intelligence, he and I had chats around about 1995, 1996. And at that time he said to me, the hot button in all the world's air forces is pilotless planes. And he said to me at the time that America, Germany, Israel, and South Africa had aerial technology that other countries did not have. But I noticed with interest that he'd mentioned Germany. And the big thing that he was trying to push me towards was the concept of pilotless planes. He said pilotless planes is a big thing. And everybody's busy with it, and it's very much hush-hush. And that was 20 years ago when he said that. And I know that even in South Africa, they were busy playing around with pilotless planes in the early 1970s. For the purposes of UFOs and aliens, the pilotless plane becomes the perfect vehicle for carrying out all kinds of games and deceptions. Those of you who saw my video, Secret Wars and Low White Morale, You will remember at the end of that, I showed you some film footage of the D-21 pilotless plane, which was able to fly at Mach 3 over China, and which was launched from an SR71 Blackbird. So this will give you an idea that some very, very advanced ideas were already in progress 40 and 50 years ago. But in the case of the Germans, I assure you the Germans must be up to a lot of interesting things. I'm sure that the Germans are just extremely hush-hush about these things. In those funny UFO pictures I had at the beginning of this video, the second one seems to be some sort of enormous strange craft seen in Germany. I don't know how much of a hoax it is or what exactly it is, but you never know. It might be some of the things the Germans are playing games with. But the nice thing about pilotless planes is there are all sorts of things you can do with pilotless aircraft that you can't do with manned aircraft. And pilotless aircraft open up the scope for a lot of really interesting things. But we'll get back to that a bit later. So now you can also see, as this documentary shows, that in this game of secrecy, while many people are thinking that there are aliens at Area 51, the Russians, with their spy satellites, managed to figure out what exactly was at Area 51. And they already had a drawing of it, and they could pick it up via the shadow that it left, and its infrared cameras could pick that up. So that shows you that when it's one nation versus another nation, it's not so much the ordinary people who will get to the truth. It's the other nation's spy agencies who will get to the truth first. So now they have to start fooling the other nation. And this is where spying also becomes an interesting form of psychological warfare. Because as countries discover things about each other, they also have to try and throw each other off the track. And it becomes a whole series of very, very complicated games with all kinds of strange spin-offs. And if you go and you study previous histories of secret wars, like the secret wars that went on during World War II, where the British were trying to fool the Germans and the Germans trying to fool the British and so forth, then you'll see all these kinds of games and counter games that start going on. That is the nature of this game. Now that man said, we always wanted them, the Russians, to think that we had something that they didn't have. This in itself is very, very true. And the lengths to which nations will go to fool each other will knock your socks off. I always got hold of all kinds of books that looked interesting. I have a book that I've never heard anybody ever talk about or mention. And this was a book about how the Russians in the 1930s were trying to fool America into thinking that they had aircraft that could fly longer ranges than they actually could. And this book contains photographs and the details of how the Russians actually set up a sort of a runway in Alaska. And they flew planes from Russia, landed them in Alaska, refueled them, and then flew them into America. And then they said to everybody via the news that we have planes that can fly all the way from Russia across the North Pole into America non-stop. But it wasn't true. And it's a deception that the Russians pretty much got away with. It's only this one book that I've seen that ever gave details and photographs and showed this deception by the Russians. And it gets very interesting. You'll see another thing that America does. America will sell military planes and tanks to other countries that might even be its enemy. And I have wondered whether they put software into these machines. And virtually every machine that you get these days, even your average car, has got lots and lots of software in it. But military equipment has got even more software in it, and much more sophisticated software. And this is very hard to reproduce and very hard to make sense of. So if you try to steal somebody else's designs, if you also don't have proper documentation and details of the software, you can end up with a lot of problems. You can't just reproduce that stuff as is, and if you do, you don't know exactly what you're going to get. So it is possible to start planting all kinds of things into software for the event that a device is stolen or used by the enemy. It opens up a whole other world. I've also read where a British brigadier general, I think he was, wrote about how first world countries will be able to attack third world countries in the future. And he spoke about going in and switching off their computers and destroying their computer systems as a prelude to invasion. We are in a world now where the first world countries have such an advantage over third world countries that they can literally walk in and out of those nations undetected. Even if those nations have got radar and all sorts of things, they can waltz in and out of them undetected. And if you study closely what the American military has been doing since 9/11, you'll see that America's military probably moves into and out of most nations on earth, except the ones in Europe, I would think. But most other nations, they move into and out of them with special forces, with helicopters, with planes. They move into and out of them literally undetected at will. The CIA does it. The American military does it. They do this with ease. So returning to this concept of making the enemy think you have something that they don't have, this is a big part of the scientific game. British scientist wrote a lot about this. He wrote about dead ends, where you think up an idea that's actually unworkable. You get technical people, you get engineers, you get scientists, they get together, and then they come up with an idea that they know is unworkable. And you know how it even works, as this British scientist was saying, many countries will spend money on a certain kind of investigation or something that they are trying to build. And then they find that they've tried to build this thing, but there are so many complications that they can't make this thing work. So now they've reached a dead end, and they've lost a lot of money and time in that effort. But then what they do is their scientists and engineers get together, and they create a story which they then leak through their intelligence services to the enemy and to the enemy's spies. And they say, oh, you know, this thing that we tried to build, it was a huge success. And we've got this enormous advantage over you. And then the other side, upon detecting this, they say, good God, these people are 30 years ahead of us in this. We must immediately put a lot of money into this right now. This is urgent. And they go and they spend a whole lot of money, and they send scientists and engineers on a wild goose chase that ultimately is also going to end in failure. And that's the kind of games that these nations play with each other. And that's what these guys are alluding to. And these things are done all the time. This is a normal part of this game. So pretending you have something that you don't really have is a very important game. And it's a game that the military is good at playing. So these people play all these kinds of games, and they do it for national security purposes. They do it to waste the enemy's resources on something else. And that's the kind of stuff these guys are doing. They're spying on each other, they're lying to each other, they're trying to trick each other, they're constantly trying to outwit each other. This is how the world really works. So there they say that General Sanford of Air Force Intelligence confirms that these are not top secret weapons that people are seeing. And there you can see he denies it. He would never say, oh yes, what you saw was top secret. Top secret does not work that way. Secret does not work that way. You don't even admit that it exists to begin with. Now, one of the very interesting parts of this video was bringing out the Project Blue Book guys and saying how these guys were told to lie. So when these guys were busy investigating UFOs, if they discovered that a certain UFO actually coincided with a top secret military project, they then had to invent a cover story because they had to hide the real thing. Now this instance where this guy says, with all due respect to the Air Force, I believe some of these will be shown to be of interplanetary origin. He makes it appear as if he, as an employee, has the right to say something that goes against his organization. If you have dealt in any business, in any corporation, and you know somebody who makes a statement on behalf of that corporation, and he's not allowed to speak on their behalf, or he's their spokesman, but he says something that he's not authorized to say, that guy's going to be fired for that kind of stuff. Now, in the military, if you have a military spokesman who goes out and suddenly pretends to have an attack of conscience and honesty, and here in front of the cameras, he now starts saying things that he's not authorized to say, or he shows independent initiative in directions which they do not approve of, that man can be in really big trouble. If he's in the military, he could be court-martialed or punished in some way. So don't be fooled by statements of military people when they seem to say all kinds of weird things. Those people know, and they would not achieve that rank that they are in if they acted irresponsibly and did not follow orders. That kind of thing would be big problems for them. It would be a career-ending move. So these guys are saying these things, and they're saying it because that's what they've been told to say. And if ever you come across an instance where a colonel or a general says something, remember, no matter what his rank is, he can only say what the organization allows him to say. And if he in any way does things that the military structure does not approve of, he will be in enormous trouble. These people do not just say anything that comes to mind. They are responsible people in responsible positions. And let me just point out something else about the military structure that might not be apparent to civilians. The military have got their own military police. The military have got their own military legal system. The military have their own jails. So they can take anybody that is in their ranks, they can send their own police to arrest them, to put them on trial, and to chuck them in their own jails. And that entire process will take place without a newspaper getting any wind of it at all. They have a complete structure that is totally theirs, and they don't have to answer to anybody. That is how military issues are handled. They've got their own legal system, their own court system, their own police system, their own jail system. And this is true for every military force in the world. The most important part of this documentary for me is about 20 seconds long, and it was the piece where I drew your attention twice. In the days when I was so fascinated by UFOs, I came across these many reports where pilots and their passengers and their crew saw UFOs. I came across many reports, and the UFO investigators always said how credible these pilots were, etc. These were some of the best reports about the existence of UFOs and so forth. And you would get these reports where the pilots and some of the passengers would say, oh, we were flying and we saw this alien spaceship and it was doing this and it was doing that, and so forth. And when I was reading these books, especially when I was young, I used to say to myself, well, surely not everybody is a liar. Surely that when there are a whole bunch of people, that there will be at least one person who will tell the truth. And that was one of the things that kept me going with these UFO reports, was the notion that somewhere along the line, there was some guy who was telling the truth. And all you had to do was figure out which one it was, and then you'd have the answer. What I could never imagine was how it was possible for everybody to lie. And when it came to the civilians on these planes, under what conditions can you put a bunch of people into something? They don't know each other from a bar of soap, and they would in unison lie together. I just could never imagine such a thing. Such a thing couldn't even enter my mind as a possibility. And yet, that is exactly what happened. And it's those 20 seconds of the video that is really crucial, and which we're going to dig into a little bit more. Because here they tell you that the commercial pilots saw these planes. This guy laughs at them because he says that they were among the most panicky people around. So that's not a good reflection on these pilots. But anyway, these commercial pilots apparently were panicking, and they'd be radioing like crazy. And then, of course, the CIA picks up on this, and here's the really interesting part. The CIA would instruct the FBI to go and meet the plane. So they would quickly be able to figure out which plane it is, where it's landing, and see to it that it has a reception committee. And it's that reception committee that's really interesting, because he talks about an inadvertent disclosure document. So the American equivalent of the Official Secrets Act is actually a thing called inadvertent exposure to classified security data or information. And it reads as follows: I fully understand that my inadvertent exposure to classified security data or information relative to the United States subjects me to the provisions of Title 18, Sections 793 to 798 of the United States Code, inclusive, and if I am subject to military jurisdictions, provisions of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, I am aware that the punishment for certain of the above referenced statutes can be imprisonment for any term of years or for life. I do therefore solemnly swear or affirm that I shall never divulge, publish, or release, either by word, conduct, or any other means, the content or substance of the classified security data, or information of which I have become aware. Only written official notice of specific authorization will release me from this obligation. I further understand that no change in my assignment, employment, residence, or citizenship will ever relieve me of my responsibilities under this oath, except as defined above. So there's something really interesting. If we look up the Official Secrets Act on Wikipedia, it says, the Official Secrets Act is a term used in Hong Kong, India, Ireland, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom, and formerly in Canada and New Zealand, for legislation that provides for the protection of state secrets and official information, mainly related to national security. I will add that in Rhodesia we had an Official Secrets Act, and I'm sure that South Africa also had some version of this. The terminology might not be exactly the same. But every single country on earth has some form of legislation that protects state secrets. So regarding the Official Secrets Act, it says, people working with sensitive information are commonly required to sign a statement to the effect that they agree to abide by the restrictions of the Official Secrets Act. This is popularly referred to as signing the Official Secrets Act. Signing this has no effect on which actions are legal, as the act is a law and not a contract, and individuals are bound by it whether or not they have signed it. Signing it is intended more as a reminder to the person that they are under such obligations. To this end, it is common to sign this statement both before and after a period of employment that involves access to secrets, e.g. MI5, MI6. So here they tell you that the Official Secrets Act is a law and not a contract, meaning that it doesn't matter whether you agree to it or not, you will be held responsible. And it doesn't matter whether you know or don't know or anything like that. None of those things matter, because once you contravene the law, you're going to be punished. Now, in the case of America, it is interesting that it states here very clearly that this inadvertent exposure to classified security data, this is very interesting because it means that anybody, even if you aren't under any formal obligation, if you run into military stuff, state secret stuff, you will be held accountable for it. And in here it also points that if you are under military jurisdiction, and they say here, Uniform Code of Military Justice, so that shows you again that America's military has its own military legal system. So the military are under even more obligations than the normal people. But notice here that it tells you, you will not in any way, shape or form publish, divulge, by word, by conduct, in any way. And it doesn't matter even if you leave America, even if you become a citizen of another country, you still cannot open your mouth about it. And the punishment is any term of years or life. So that shows you how serious this business is. So this brings us to the FBI and the plane landing. When the plane lands, they make the passengers, the pilot, the crew, they make them sign that thing. Those people, whether they sign it or not, they are anyway under obligation to it, and they will be punished. So these people will lie. And if you dare to open your mouth and break the law, then you will be punished. And that explains how so many people can see supposed UFOs and will testify to it, because they know that if they go and tell what they actually saw, what awaits them is a jail sentence. And that's how it works. And this simple thing tells you how so many people can turn around and say, we were on a plane and we saw an alien. And We describe it. And they'll happily describe that, because it's either you do the thing properly and keep your mouth shut, or you're going to have some jail time for yourself. So that is the part that's missing, and I thought this was absolutely critical. I went and did a bit of hunting around. As good as the internet is, there are lots of things it doesn't have. And among the things I was looking for good UFO stories. In my older books, which unfortunately I've packed away, so they're in storage, and I can't go through them now, I remember coming across lots of stories, and the UFO investigators would say our most credible sightings came from pilots, came from crews. The entire plane saw the alien craft. Now I'm going to give you one that I found. I was just hunting around to see if I could find any UFO sightings that may have been reported as UFO sightings, but actually match up to what this documentary is telling us and what the CIA is telling us. Because the CIA also said that 50% of sightings are actually of classified missions. So here we see 1957. So 1957, Oxcart was not flying, it was the U-2. And the U-2 was aluminum and it was bright. And if the sun caught it correctly, it would glint. So listen to this. October 8, 1957, another Pan-American pilot sighted an unidentified light, Captain Joseph L. Flynn, bringing a DC-7C flight into New York from Paris. Noticed the UFO at 7:05 a.m., about 25 miles southwest of Boston. So this is in the morning. And remember that the U-2s are flying 3 times higher than those commercial flights at their highest. So he said, the object, quotes, like a star traveling very fast, quotes, showed up to the right of the plane. The sun was directly behind the plane, and the object glowed a very bright silver. So here you can see the sun was behind the plane, and this man, this pilot, was watching the sun reflecting off of a U-2 spy plane. He thought it was a UFO. Captain Flynn said, it was much brighter than the morning star. The pilot turned the plane and for 5 minutes tried to follow the UFO, but it sped out of sight. And indeed it would. It is much faster than a commercial plane. At first, Captain Flynn assumed the object was the Russian satellite Sputnik 1, but a check with the Smithsonian Institution's Astrophysical Observatory revealed that the satellite had passed over the New York area at 8:03 a.m., nearly an hour after the UFO sighting. Nor would a satellite be so readily visible or appear to travel at high speed as described. So that particular instance matches up perfectly with a U-2 spy plane. He spotted a U-2 spy plane in the daylight, the sun glinted off of it, and he thought it was a UFO. And he couldn't explain it as a satellite because it wasn't a satellite. So that instance where the CIA could just call the FBI and the FBI would quickly go and make people sign that inadvertent disclosure document, that is how they must have silenced thousands upon thousands upon thousands of civilians. And those people, unless they get written permission, even now, if they dare to speak about it, they can go to jail. How interesting is that? And that is how the government has power over ordinary people in ways that you just wouldn't even think. but it shows you how slick the military processes are, how slick and effective they really are at taking care of people and at keeping a secret a secret. In this case, I don't see any problem with it, because when you're dealing with the military, you're dealing with life and death. You're dealing with your own life and death. You're dealing with the life and death of your nation. So there are some things that really have to be kept secret. And you can't have one country telling everything openly and everybody else keeps secrets. That is also just a path to suicide. So in this world, this is the way we have to live. But it was very impressive for me to see how slick these guys were and how they managed to keep everything sorted out. And notice also how they told all the air traffic controllers that they are not allowed to state that there are aircraft inside American airspace that are exceeding certain speeds. And how they even lie to the air traffic controllers who do manage to find out the truth. It's very interesting. These guys really do a good job, and it shows you how they can keep a secret a secret. If I think back to UFOs and what I used to read about all these aliens, if you dig into that and look into the past, you'll find an interesting thing. In one of my videos, I discussed the truth versus lying. And I pointed out that the truth is consistent. The truth never changes. But a lie changes. And people who invent lies have to modify their lies, because all kinds of problems come up, and then they have to modify the lies to improve on them. So a lie changes with time. Now, if you look at UFOs and you look at the history of UFOs, you'll see that what people originally reported as a UFO in, say, the 1940s versus the 1950s versus the 60s versus the 70s versus now, you will discover that the storyline has changed. In the days before satellites had gone off to Venus and Mars, people reported meeting people from Venus. The spaceships were landing and people from Venus were coming out. And then after the satellites had been to Venus and to Mars, then nobody reported meeting Venusians and Martians ever again. And then it became the Greys. And the story has evolved and it's changed. And the shapes of the UFOs have changed. And the styles of the UFOs have changed. So if aliens were coming from another galaxy and they'd come from 100,000 light years away, you'd expect that if they were, say, 10 million years in advance of us, that the craft that are reaching us would at least be consistent. But they're not consistent. And you'll see this in the whole story of UFOs. You'll see how different people said different things, and that groups of people at the same time were saying the same things in corroboration with each other. But then 10 years later, the story would have changed some more. And the story keeps evolving, and it changes. And this, to me, is also an indication that you're dealing with a lie, that people are making stuff up. One of the biggest turn-offs I experienced in my life was I was invited to a certain conference because I was very interested in these things. And I ended up in a certain conference overseas, and I actually met some of these people who wrote books about UFOs. I met them in person, and I had dinner with them, and I listened to them talk and everything. And I've got to be honest with you, going to one of those conferences was one of the biggest turn-offs of all for me. So with time, and in chatting to all kinds of different people, I've become a firmer and firmer believer that what you are looking at is military activity. It's all earthbound. And there are reasons for this game. Spying is the most important reason. When I spoke to that guy who'd worked in national intelligence, he said some weird things to me, but I think he was trying to convey some concepts to me. And he said to me, look into the issue of pilotless planes. And then he also spoke about spying, and he said, when people see a UFO, they immediately think, it could be the Martians, or it could be people from Alpha Centauri. They never think, that spaceship is from Spain, or it's from Cuba. So what he got at was that if you think you saw a UFO, you don't immediately think, it must be the Russians, it must be the Indians, it must be Italy. You don't think like that. And that's a very important thing, because it's got to do with responsibility. So if you want to start hiding things, and you want to do sneaky things, then it helps if you throw people off your track. Another thing about UFOs is you'll find that many UFOs are either spying on military bases or in the vicinity of military bases. There's all kinds of stuff. Once you start looking at the military link, you'll see there's lots and lots of it. Once I started realizing that stealth planes existed, I then went and looked at UFO reports, and whenever I heard that there was a UFO that was triangular, if it had a triangular or triangular type shape, that implies aerodynamics. And then I would say that's definitely military. If you look again at that little video that I had at the intro, you'll see the last one on there was a triangular looking craft. I don't know who created that video. I just found a video where someone said, here are the best UFO sightings, and he had a whole bunch of them, and I just pulled out a couple that were quite clear that you could look at. So I don't know if any of them are complete hoaxes created by computer, and how much of it is actual film footage. But the last two sets of UFOs on my short little video, if you look at them really closely, those look in every way to me as if they could be built by our engineers right now. If you look at them closely, they have got all kinds of strange features. Again, go back into the history and look at how flying saucers used to look, and look at what you see here. You'll see they look very different now. Those particular craft that you see there, I think that given the state of science right now, they could easily build craft that look exactly like that. And that very last one is very interesting. Again, I don't know if the footage is real, but look at it. It's a triangular craft, and it appears to be hovering, turning slowly, tilting a little bit this way, tilting a little bit that way. Now, in the days before computers could fly planes, that would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to do. But nowadays, most aircraft are flown by computers, and a computer can do that kind of stuff easily. Then look at that craft as it turns. At a point you will see two tails. It has two tails, which is very much like what stealth aircraft have. They have two tails, and that again implies aerodynamics. So this thing seems to have the capability to hover, but then it can also have forward motion. The other interesting thing about that one is the funny circle that appears. Notice how the triangular shape is black, and black is normally what military use to hide things at night. All the stealth planes in the US Air Force are painted black because they operate at night. Black is the natural camouflage for night. And then this kind of bubble explodes, and the bubble is lit. So if you were far away, you wouldn't see that black triangular craft. What you would be seeing is that white ball. Now that white ball is interesting. It makes me almost think of one of those airbags that explodes in your car that is a safety feature of a car. It's like a similar material that can explode, and it actually turns instantly into a bubble. And then it seems to me there's a light shining on it. So now when you have this bubble, which might be of some kind of plastic, if you shine a light on it, it seems to have properties whereby the light is evenly reflected off it. So now it appears as if the whole thing is glowing. So I don't know if that is real film footage, but everything in that footage, I would say that is something that is easily doable by scientists and engineers right now. They don't need to do much in order to be able to do that. Here in South Africa, we had a bunch of UFO sightings. And in one of my discussions with a guy years ago, he told me how he'd been doing military service in 1972, and he was on guard duty at an army base that was next to an Air Force base in Voortrekkerhoogte, which I mentioned earlier. And he said the guys who did guard duty spoke about some kind of funny little plane that would fly at night. And he said one day he was lucky enough to see it. He said he was on guard duty, and he was in a tower that was overlooking the runway. And as it became dark, and it was properly dark, he saw that they opened a hangar door, and in the light he could see they brought out a very small aircraft. Its engine started, and he said the sound was almost like a buzzing noise, but it was a little jet. And the engine made almost a buzzing noise. It started, he saw it running down the runway, and it took off into the night sky. And it disappeared. And he said it was gone for about 2 hours, and suddenly he heard this buzzing noise again, and the little plane came down and landed. And the moment it landed, they opened the hangar doors and they put it inside. He said to me that if I go to the Air Force Museum in Pretoria, that I would find that little plane is now on display there. And it's one of the places I want to visit in the coming months. I want to go to the Air Force Museum anyway. But he said that it's a little pilotless plane and it's been declassified quietly in the meantime, and I'd find it on display in the Air Force Museum. So I want to go and take a look at that sometime. When I was in Nevada, I heard an interesting story. When I read all these UFO stories, another common aspect of UFO stories was that aliens have the technology to switch off your car engine. There were lots and lots of UFO reports where people would be driving along, they'd see a light, it would look like a flying saucer, and their car engine would switch off. And then they'd talk about how these aliens could switch off their car engine, and then when the aliens go away, then the car starts again. And I always was led to believe that this is some kind of alien technology that we don't have. In later years, I learned that there's a thing called an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. When a nuclear bomb is set off, it also sets off a tremendous magnetic pulse. And if a nuclear bomb is exploded at very high level above the United States or any other place on Earth, the electromagnetic pulse can destroy almost all computer and other sensitive electrical equipment. This magnetic pulse will just fry the equipment, your computers will cease to work, etc., etc. And it affects electrical systems. When I visited the United States in 2010, I was visiting some people in Nevada, in northern Nevada, and they had some problems with internet access. And so the guy had some satellite dishes and things, and he got his internet through satellite. And while we were talking the one day, we were discussing aircraft, etc., and he happened to mention that sometimes U.S. Army Chinook helicopters, those big helicopters with the 2 rotor blades, they can pick up tremendous masses. He said that sometimes Chinook helicopters fly past his house. And then he mentioned that on occasion, when a Chinook comes by, that there have been occasions where his electricity goes out. And his electricity goes out and the Chinook flies past, and then the electricity comes on again. And that sounds very much like what people were describing regarding aliens. And it brings me back to what I said earlier about the Brigadier General, the British guy who was talking about switching off third world countries stuff. So what I suspect is that the US Army has got some device that can generate an electromagnetic pulse. But it possibly is a big thing, and the equipment to generate it is heavy. And so the place that they put it into is a Chinook helicopter, because it can carry it. Something along those lines. So when I look back on lots and lots and lots of UFO reports, there are so many of them that if you had to look at them again, and you had to go through them one by one, knowing what you know about military secrecy, you could start asking a lot of interesting questions. And you will even find that there are UFO reports where the UFOs are chased by American aircraft, or where the UFO is escorted by helicopters. And sometimes these helicopters are all unmarked, which means that they obviously are classified and belong to some agency. And this makes me think that there are UFOs that are experimental aircraft. Returning to South Africa, I remember about 20 years or so ago, there were a number of UFO sightings here in South Africa that actually got onto the main media. And I remember one in particular that occurred in Bloemfontein, where people saw this UFO at night. But the UFO was an extremely bright ball. People filmed it. It was on the front page of newspapers. There was this enormous ball of light flying around in the sky, floating in the sky, and then disappearing at high speed and all that sort of stuff. But it was extremely visible. And I began to think that while there are times when the military want to hide their aircraft, there may also be times when they are either experimenting with other things. It brings us back to psychological warfare. There might be times when, for military purposes, you want to play God. Let me give you an example. Alexander the Great, the king of Greece, when he went on the rampage and he invaded Persia and he conquered the Persian Empire and he fought his way through to India, he was quite a master of psychological warfare, of intimidating his enemies into surrendering rather than fighting him. But one of the most interesting things he did once was he was besieging the city, and he wasn't making much headway with the city. It was well defended, the walls were high, and it didn't look as if he was going to have an easy victory or even any victory at all. And Alexander the Great noticed that there was a big tower on this wall. And he made a plan. He was young, he was athletic, and he and some of his soldiers went and climbed the wall and the tower during the night. So he climbed to the top of this tower in the night. And in the morning, he stood on the top of this tower and he addressed the people of the city. And he said to them that he is a god, that he flew onto the top of this tower in the night, and that he will conquer them, and that it is better for them if they just surrender to him. And the city surrendered to Alexander the Great. So that's an example of a military commander who pretends he is a god. And it worked. It saved the lives of his soldiers, saved him money, and he was able to move on. In Africa, in the country of Kenya, which used to be a British colony, there was a rebellion called the Mau Mau Rebellion. And it was one of those communist incited things as part of the Cold War. The Mau Mau were attacking whites and they were killing whites. But the Mau Mau, like many Africans, believe that the spirits of their ancestors inhabit certain trees. And it turned out that there was a certain type of a tree, a certain type of a plant, where the Mau Mau believed this plant is where their ancestors live in. And the English went and they developed a type of a way of injecting these trees with something. And these trees then started dying. So then the British said to these blacks, those trees are dying because your ancestors are unhappy with you. Again, psychological warfare in a wartime situation. So let's go back to UFOs. If you start playing around with things in the sky, and you're starting to deal with other people in other countries, in other places, with strange beliefs, you can start messing with their heads. So playing around in the sky is a very interesting thing because it could be part of all kinds of psychological warfare that might have its uses. It might have its uses against primitive tribesmen in other places where you are fighting wars or doing something. And another aspect of UFOs is the illusion part of UFOs. During World War II, in the fighting in North Africa, there was a particular set of installations near the Suez Canal that the Germans were bombing, and the English wanted to stop this. The English actually hired a magician, an illusionist. They hired an illusionist and asked him if there was any way that they could make it difficult or impossible for the Germans to bomb these installations along the Suez Canal. Now the magician came up with an idea that had to do with placing lights on the ground and shining them in various ways that would disorientate the German pilots. And they used this, and apparently it was somewhat successful and disorientating to the Germans. So that is an example of a magician bringing the art of illusion into warfare. So let's go back to magicians, because magicians are a topic that apply to psychological warfare in a big way. Magic is a topic that I want to bring into some of my videos because I want to show you again, especially now that some magicians have come out and they've shown you how some of these tricks are done, you get to see how complicated magical tricks actually work. They show you exactly how they do it and how they fool you. I personally enjoyed watching shows like that. I watched every single one that I could, and I tried every time before they showed you how it was done, I tried to work out how I thought it was done. And as time went by, I got better at guessing. But I must tell you, there came a point where, even though I knew how many tricks had been done, I was surprised at how you can still be caught off guard. There are many different ways to perform illusions. And magic shows are illusions. They are trying to fool you that something happened which you know is impossible, and they manage to pull it off. Your mind is telling you, yes, they really did cut that girl in half, and yes, they did put her back together. That is the only possible option. And in fact, your mind is wrong. It isn't the only possible option. The darkness, the curtains, the smoke, the mirrors, all those things all come into play so professionally, and it fools you. and it fools you almost every time. You can sit and watch the same trick over and over again and still not see how the heck they managed to do it. There was one time where I was at a magic show where they brought in an American magician here in South Africa. And they hired this magician, they brought him in from New York, and he walked around from table to table doing close-up magic. And I sat right next to people at another table, watching from just a few feet away, and I got to tell you, I couldn't for the life of me figure out how he was doing it. It was right there in front of my face. I was sitting there, and I couldn't believe how he was pulling it off. And that, of course, is the art of magic. They are very good at doing this, and they know what your weaknesses are, and they know how to take advantage of it. Now, you can take that, and you can apply that with science and mathematics and engineering, and you can start creating illusions in the sky. So stealth is about taking planes and hiding them completely from radar. But there may be other things that they want to do. Maybe there are times when they want to make things visible. Maybe they want to make something visible in one part of the sky in order to hide something happening in another part of the sky. Who knows what the logical reason would be? So it could be that they want to make something appear to be there that isn't really there. Now this is where pilotless planes and computer-flown planes become really interesting. Because now, with pilotless planes, it doesn't matter if it crashes, and it can be much smaller. So you don't have to worry about a human surviving. If it falls, no people were injured in the process. It also means that you can make turns that are much sharper. Turns that would kill a human being, you can do with a pilotless plane. And in fact, controlling things from a distance is something that's been done long ago. As long ago as the 1890s, Nikola Tesla demonstrated radio-controlled boats to the Royal Navy in Britain. The Germans had a little anti-tank bomb called a Goliath, which was radio-controlled. They had other radio-controlled bombs. So radio control's been around for more than a century. But now, of course, with computers and software, you can do all kinds of things. You can have the plane flying itself, and you can sometimes send it instructions, and when you don't send it instructions, it has the intelligence to know what to do. You could create illusions in the air. You could have things flying, and with a series of arrangements of lights, you could make people think, there's an alien spacecraft in the sky and it's a mile long. Wow, isn't that impressive? A mile-long spaceship, and it must be filled with aliens. How big that thing would be, and, what technology could do that it can fly without wings, etc., etc. But this is all part of the magic act. So these people should be able to do lots of magic acts in the air, in whatever way they want to. And that's the kind of stuff that you need to think about, is military people with serious things in mind, but the problems they are solving might not be problems that are familiar to you. They may have a secret goal that you don't know about. That goal might not even relate to America itself. It might be for things that they are busy preparing for other countries, but then Americans happen to see it because it's being built in America. It's being tested and developed in America. But its real place of activity is overseas, because in the case of these spy planes, that's exactly what was happening. They were being built for use in Russia. That was where they were really going to work. Another video that I'd like to look for, just to give you an example of how advanced these people were 50 years ago. You may have seen in the last year or so, there was a guy who jumped out of a balloon at the highest altitude ever, and he set a record. The only problem was that the original record had been set by an American military officer in the 1950s. So this record had not been broken in 50 years. And it turns out that at the same time as these things were going on at Area 51, the American military was preparing the way for spaceflight. And the way that they were testing things was they had these enormous balloons which were floating up as high as possible, and the most dangerous mission of the time was for Air Force officers to volunteer to jump out of balloons on the edge of space. And these guys would go up alone. They had no way of being helped if anything went wrong. It was the most dangerous mission in the Air Force. And yet there were many volunteers who volunteered for it. They would go up in these balloons to the edge of space, and they'd jump off with these pressurized suits, and they would fall these long distances and hopefully survive. And that is how they set these records. But of course, they weren't doing this to set records. The real reason they were jumping off from the edge of space was because they were trying to find answers to various problems. They were trying to make discoveries and to see how they could do things. And among the things they did from the edge of space was they had devices, re-entry devices that engineers were devising. They were inventing all sorts of devices. Then they'd take them up in these balloons, take them to very high altitudes, and then drop them off and see how they would survive re-entry. So they were carrying out experiment after experiment after experiment to try and see what different ways they could build re-entry vehicles and which designs would work the best. So all of these guys were doing these things on the edge of space in the 1950s, and it was all top secret. So if any of you can find any one of those videos, I know that I had some of them on my VHS tapes, but I'm really struggling. I've been going through them, and there are lots of things that I did tape that I still haven't found. This particular documentary was one of them. So I was delighted that I got this because I wanted people to see this. This is a very, very important documentary. So that pretty much sums up aliens. Don't believe the mass media when they tell you people can't keep secrets. Don't believe the mass media when they tell you conspiracies don't exist. The mass media is lying to you. It's misdirecting you. It's misdirecting you on so many levels. And the mass media has its own agenda. And that agenda is the agenda of its owners. It's got nothing to do with what is good, what is right, what is in the interests of your country. The mass media is an alien thing. It doesn't even belong to your country. And yet in every country we have this mass media that does its own thing. For me, when I look at these documentaries and I see what these guys do, I'm very impressed with their professionalism. I'm impressed with their commitment. It shows you can give them a job and they do their job and they keep their mouths shut and they do really important stuff. They're actually keeping people safe in their beds at night. These guys who were doing all these activities and spying on America's enemies, they were keeping people safe in their beds at night, and they stopped nuclear war from becoming a reality. For us in Africa, the Cold War wasn't a Cold War, it was a hot war. And we had to fight many wars and many battles here that ran for decades as we tried to stop all the various groups that were being sponsored by the Russians, by the Chinese. So don't believe that the Cold War was a figment of people's imagination. If you go and you start digging into your history, you'll see it was very, very real. But it was a type of a war fought with a certain strategy that the West decided to fight it with. They decided to go for a slow war rather than a hot war. There were American generals who did not want to fight a Cold War. General Patton wanted to invade Russia immediately, and he died under very mysterious circumstances. General MacArthur wanted America to drop nuclear bombs on China, and the moment he suggested that, he was fired. So this is the politics around the Cold War. But the Cold War was a very real war. And this shows you what the CIA was doing during the Cold War. This is just one of many things that they were doing. There is one other idea that I have pondered. There have been some UFO sightings where people claimed that they saw a vehicle that was escorted by unmarked helicopters at night. So that already should tell you military. But this UFO had tremendous amounts of heat, unbelievable amounts of heat. It may even have melted the tar. And I have heard that there was one particular UFO incident where all the people who saw the UFO had to be admitted to hospital for radiation sickness. And it made me wonder whether these people inadvertently stumbled on a nuclear-powered aircraft of some kind that the military was building. I repeat, a nuclear-powered vehicle. The Russians actually built a nuclear-powered bomber. The nuclear-powered bomber produced so much radiation that I think all the crew got cancer or died, something like that. The Russians built a nuclear-powered bomber. They did fly this thing, but it was extremely dangerous to the crew. The crew would die eventually from the radiation they got from this thing. But I have been wondering whether America is not much more advanced in the building of nuclear-powered engines. I know that with regard to space travel, engineers have spoken about nuclear-powered rockets. You have nuclear-powered subs and ships, and that's because they can handle the size of the nuclear engine. The next problem is, how do you make nuclear engines that are a lot smaller? So I would imagine that nuclear-powered aircraft or anything nuclear-powered that can fly in the air or in space could be something that they've been working on for decades already. And they may have made lots of progress that you know nothing about. So that would be something else that would be strictly military, strictly controlled. And now and then they maybe decide to do a test flight. And that's where some of these sightings occur. Now, if you go back to Area 51, they did thousands of flights. And thousands of those flights, nobody suspected a thing. And it may well be the case with these types of things. In this documentary, they said that Area 51 is the home of America's black projects. But in this documentary, these guys could also be telling certain lies in order to mislead you. I would imagine that Area 51 has certain negatives in the sense that too many people are looking there already. So there may well be other Area 51s that people don't know about, that maybe have less activity. In the following film footage, I've cut together various pieces for you, just so that you can get an idea about nuclear propulsion in aircraft and in rockets. The Russians pretended that they had a nuclear-powered aircraft in 1958, and that was proven to be a hoax. That is exactly the kind of fooling around that I've mentioned before. But later on they discovered that the Russians really did try to actually build one, and they took a bomber, modified it, and they put a nuclear reactor in this bomber, and they flew it and they tested it 40 times. But as you will see, many of the crew died thereafter. You'll also see that in the 1960s, they were already proposing a nuclear-powered cruise missile, and that gets away from the problem of the radiation shielding. But you must remember that with research, they'll try and solve any problems that they need to solve. So one doesn't know what progress they may have made. Maybe they've made progress in terms of shielding the crew. Maybe they are just looking at using nuclear-powered aircraft and spacecraft in a pilotless mode. And then finally, there'll be some film footage from a 1968 NASA movie where they talk about nuclear space propulsion in the future. You can see that a lot of grandiose plans, and nowadays they've gone completely backwards, and they don't have any of those grandiose plans that they used to have. Shows you how things have slid downwards. I have a theory that the world is slowing down. We are not progressing as fast as we could, and it's because of all this other political nonsense that is holding us back more and more. Here is some footage for you to look at, and it'll give you an idea of just how real these things are, and also how old they are. You'll see these ideas are old. They were proposed already in the 1940s. But it just takes time for the technologies to ripen and for them to find the right combination that will work. So there may be all kinds of programs that are not high priority, but they are doing research and they're carrying on slowly over a period of time. And to me, nuclear-powered devices other than ships and submarines, that must be one of the hot buttons that people are working towards, because even if they don't have a use for it now, the potential for these things in the future could be tremendous.
as a military man, was very suspicious of the military-industrial complex, and always suspected that these kind of companies were pushing projects too far and too fast just in order to gain big contracts. His Deputy Defence Secretary then ordered a stop to the X6 and WS-125 programs in the view that they were just far too ambitious. And I think that was a realistic assessment. So he ordered those programs stopped and ordered the agency to concentrate on trying to get the engine right.
As a result, the NB-36 flying reactor made its last flight on March the 28th, 1957. It was decommissioned at Fort Worth in late 1957. It was scrapped several months later, with the radioactive parts being buried. It looked like the atom-powered aircraft project was grounded. But then, on December the 1st, 1958, Aviation Week magazine, America's most authoritative defense journal, splashed an amazing story. The Soviet Union had flown an atomic-powered bomber. In fact, Russia had been working in secret on a range of nuclear-powered aircraft for many years.
There was one really wild project they had in the early 50s for a flying boat that weighed 1,000 tons. But the real emphasis of the Soviet military was to keep pace with the Americans and build their own version of a nuclear-powered bomber.
The Soviets already had a long-range strategic bomber. In the West, it was known under its NATO codename, the Bear. But the Bear was too slow to penetrate America's new missile and fighter defenses. Now it appeared Russia was developing a nuclear-powered alternative. It was called the M50. Its NATO codename was Bounder. But how could the Soviets have overtaken America in nuclear-powered planes?
The Soviet researches into nuclear-powered aircraft paralleled the American ones. They had the same problems to confront. The weight of the reactor, the shielding, and they came up with much the same kind of solutions. The Russians went down the distributed shielding route as well. Curiously, the Soviet figures for the weight and size of the reactor they wanted to fly with is very similar to what the Americans came up with, about 80 tons.
News of the Soviet atom plane success, allied to the successful launch of Sputnik, now changed US policy.
The AEC, the Defense Department, or several Defense Department officials, and the Air Force then threw their weight behind an effort to get the program back up to the prestige level and the amount of input that it had before, and tried to urge the president to back it so that the Americans could have a plane flying by the early 60s.
President Eisenhower now increased the budget for America's atom plane project. But Eisenhower remained suspicious. He put the accelerated program under management he could trust.
By that time, I had already developed very substantial doubts about its practicality. The goal is a reasonable goal. I mean, an airplane with an indefinite flight time. But the practicality, and I could summarize it in 3 different areas, all of which are closely related. One is that airplanes are subject to crashing. The idea of flying around with a reactor, which sadly might crash anywhere, is just not something which could be made acceptable. The second point is that especially on the direct drive, or the direct reactor, direct heat, it was inevitable that it would constantly be spewing radioactivity out the tail. And the other one was the pilots. I mean, the question of shielding the pilots was a serious one.
Herb York was a good scientist who knew that they hadn't cracked the 4 major problems. They still hadn't built an engine that was powerful enough to get the whole shooting match off the ground. They still hadn't solved the major shielding problems. The direct cycle engine was still too dirty to be considered, and the indirect cycle, the technology was simply too immature.
Backed by Eisenhower, York imposed new goals on the project. He cancelled further development of the airframe as being premature. work would concentrate on getting a foolproof engine working. Progress was happening on the engine front. General Electric ran a series of very successful experiments using the direct cycle concept. The engine was running routinely, solely under nuclear power.
The General Electric company were eventually able to get their direct cycle engine working routinely. So the concept was proved. The trouble was they still couldn't crack the weight problem. The plane and the engine still couldn't get off the ground.
While General Electric was working on their direct cycle atomic jet engine, Pratt & Whitney was still working on the indirect cycle. Dr. York thought the indirect cycle approach, which offered the prospect of fewer dangerous leaks of radiation, was the best prospect for a working engine.
However, even with all this renewed vigour in terms of engine research, even by 1959, real progress had been very slow, and a working prototype was not even in sight.
In 1960, the political picture changed again. John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States, beating Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon. Kennedy had accused the Republican Eisenhower administration of allowing the Soviet Union to overtake America in technology and military strength. Was Kennedy going to restart the WS-125 project?
During the presidential election campaign, Kennedy blamed Eisenhower for allowing America to fall behind Russia in military terms. He blamed Eisenhower for what he called the missile gap, that Russia had more ballistic missiles than America, and also for the bomber gap.
But on taking office, Kennedy would discover Eisenhower's last secret. In the closing months of his presidency, Eisenhower had come into classified intelligence about the true state of Soviet military preparations. The new U-2 spy plane and the first space-based reconnaissance satellites had revealed the actual state of Soviet bomber and missile forces.
When Kennedy arrived in the White House, he was in for a major shock. There was no bomber gap. Indeed, it seemed that the Russians had hardly any bombers operational at all. There was no missile gap, and worse still, it appeared they didn't have an atom-powered plane. It seemed that there never had been an atom-powered plane.
The entire Aviation Week story about the Soviets flying a nuclear-powered plane had been a hoax.
There never was a nuclear-powered aircraft. There was a bounder. They built one single aircraft, the M50 bounder, but it was powered by ordinary jet engines, and it wasn't a very efficient aircraft.
This knowledge now doomed the American atomic bomber project and any prospects of a revival of the WS-125.
All that remained when he became president was research and development on the indirect drive, the liquid metal drive, and even that we're no longer talking about an airplane. So when Kennedy became president, the program was 95% gone.
The atomic bomber was finally cancelled in March 1961, only a month after Kennedy entered the White House.
The surprising thing is that just at the moment Kennedy was cancelling the A&P program, they were beginning to make breakthroughs in reactor materials that would lead eventually to lightweight reactors, particularly that could be used in spaceflight. Today, if you were trying to build a nuclear powered engine for an aircraft, you could probably do so given the technology we now have.
The atom-powered plane had been overtaken by events. The US Navy's nuclear-powered Polaris submarines were becoming operational. And America now had reliable and accurate long-range ballistic missiles. The manned bomber, no matter how powered, had become vulnerable to the anti-aircraft missile. America's flirtation with atom-powered flight was over. But the story of the nuclear-powered bomber had one last secret to give up. The very biggest of all. In the early 1990s, it was revealed that the Soviet Union had flown an atomic-powered aircraft as early as 1961.
Everyone was dumbstruck after the fall of the Iron Curtain to discover that, after all, the Russians had flown a nuclear-powered aircraft. They flew it 40 times. But this was in the 1960s, and they did it by simply not shielding the crew.
Khrushchev was so concerned by what he perceived to be American progress in building an atomic-powered bomber that he demanded one of his own. And the truth of the matter was that the Russians were playing catch-up. They built a fairly crude, direct-cycle engine, and with fairly basic shielding that not only irradiated the crew, but also passed all kinds of contaminated air into the environment as it flew.
The Russians chose the Bear as their test plane. It was powered by 2 conventional turboprop engines, but it also had 2 experimental direct-cycle jet engines. These were powered by a reactor installed in the main fuselage. Some 40 nuclear-powered flights were conducted between 1961 and 1969, with test pilot E.A. Gurianov at the controls.
I actually have a letter from test pilot Gurianov. He writes, "We had all been irradiated, but we ignored it. Of the 2 crews, only 3 men survived, a young navigator, a military navigator, and me. The first to go, a young technician, took only 3 years to die."
The problem of shielding the crew from radiation in a nuclear-powered aircraft has never really been solved. But the underlying ideas behind the NB-36 project continue to influence American military research.
Whenever you spend money on high tech, there's always the possibility and usually the reality of some useful fallout.
In April 1961, the month after Kennedy cancelled the manned nuclear-powered bomber program, a contract was awarded to the Chance Vought Aircraft Company to build an atom-powered cruise missile. With no crew involved, it would not require heavy shielding. The new weapon was to be a direct-cycle nuclear ramjet.
Just as I was leaving the directorship at Livermore, we took on the responsibility for the reactor design for the nuclear cruise missile. The cruise missile is just a pilotless airplane. You got this direct drive engine. It's just like, it's you know, a lot of parallels between it and a nuclear airplane, except since it didn't have a pilot, the shielding problem was not the same.
The new missile was called SLAM.
Chance Vought got as far as building a 1/3 prototype of the SLAM. The final design for the SLAM would be a missile that was 65 foot long. It would be fired up to high altitude to get as far as it needed to go. It was indeed a missile that would have infinite range, being nuclear-powered. But then it would drop down to 100 feet and be going at Mach 3, so this thing was absolutely unstoppable.
As well as releasing nuclear bombs, the Livermore scientists considered using the reactor itself as a lethal nuclear device which could irradiate enemy territory. It was the ultimate doomsday weapon.
You're running close to the ground, it fries everything. I mean, on top of it. So there, the radiation was an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
By 1964, SLAM was ready for flight testing. But politics was again to intervene. Kennedy and Khrushchev faced one another over Cuba, and the world came close to nuclear annihilation. In the aftermath, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed a nuclear test ban treaty.
I think the death knell of the nuclear-powered aircraft and the nuclear-powered missile came with John Kennedy. He was looking towards an accommodation with the Soviets. To have gone into that kind of nuclear technology would have been a provocation. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the general public knew how close they'd come to nuclear war.
The SLAM program was terminated in 1964, but the onboard guidance system developed for SLAM was later utilized in the conventional cruise missiles that are part of today's arsenal of US weapons.
In the end, the nuclear-powered aircraft was killed by simpler, cheaper technology. I mean, even in-flight refueling, which is routine these days, robbed it of the advantage of being able to fly forever. And the ballistic missile, which can hit a target on a postage stamp or the cruise missile with its accuracy. That did away with the need for a big bomber.
But the dream of nuclear flight may not be over. In 2003, it was revealed that the United States Air Force Research Laboratory had funded 2 studies on nuclear-powered versions of the Northrop Grumman Global Hawk. The Global Hawk is an unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV. Its principal role is as a long-range, high-altitude reconnaissance platform. It is designed to fly from the United States to any hotspot on the Earth, and then circle for days at a time, sending data back to base. The plan now is to give the Global Hawk a flight endurance of several months. Has the technology that created the NB-36 at last come of age? Will the day come when nuclear-powered UAVs cruise the skies for months or years on end? This was the dream behind the original atomic bomber, the WS-125. One of the planes that never flew.
At the same time, next week, Planes That Never Flew focuses on America's first jet fighter. Next tonight, the battle for Manchuria in Battlefield.
The moon, closest neighbor to Earth. Presently the focus of man's greatest scientific adventure, the first celestial body that will be explored by man. Landing men on the moon will be a truly great achievement, but only the beginning of a new era in space exploration. No one can predict the exact missions that will follow in the years and decades ahead. But the most exciting possibilities will require the acceleration and deceleration of very heavy loads, such as the maneuvering of large Earth-orbiting spacecraft. The transportation of large amounts of equipment and supplies to the lunar surface. And the sending of heavy spacecraft to the planets. Today's missions are being accomplished with rockets that burn chemical fuels. But chemical fuels are heavy, and the cost of putting each pound into Earth orbit is very high. Nuclear rockets, when perfected, can provide the same propulsion energy with less overall weight. They will expand our ability to explore space. This is the story. This is Saturn V, the most powerful launch vehicle being built by the United States. A 3-stage rocket that will place the Apollo spacecraft in the vicinity of the moon. The total weight of Saturn V is about 6 million pounds. Its 3 stages have chemical engines that burn fuel to generate thrust. The first and second stages provide most of the energy needed to put the third stage and the payload, about 250,000 pounds, into Earth orbit. At present, only chemical rockets can provide the high thrust needed to do this job. The third stage accelerates the payload to the velocity needed to get it to its destination. Here, travel time and payload weight are determined by the efficiency with which the propellant is converted into thrust. By substituting a nuclear third stage for Saturn V, the velocity of a given payload can be greatly increased, cutting travel time for some missions in half. This is particularly important in sending deep space probes to Jupiter and beyond. Or if shortening travel time is not essential, propellant weight can be traded off for an increased payload weight. This is important for a lunar supply mission, Earth orbital operations, and some unmanned missions to the planets. Why is the nuclear rocket so much better than the chemical rocket? In rocket propulsion, exhaust velocity determines propulsion efficiency. At a given temperature, the lighter the exhaust gas, the higher the exhaust velocity. And the higher the exhaust velocity, the more thrust is generated for each pound of propellant consumed per second. The nuclear rocket merely heats hydrogen, the lightest element of all, and expels it at tremendous velocity. Chemical rockets burn fuel to produce exhaust gases that contain heavier elements. So at the same exhaust temperature, the exhaust velocity is much lower, and each pound consumed per second produces less thrust. Rocket efficiency is stated in seconds of specific impulse. This refers to the time in seconds that 1 pound of propellant will deliver 1 pound of thrust. The higher the seconds of specific impulse, the greater the propellant economy. Our best chemical rockets of today are limited to a specific impulse of about 450 seconds, and only slight improvement can be expected. On the other hand, full-scale nuclear reactor tests have achieved 800 seconds, and laboratory tests promise even more, perhaps as much as 900 seconds. This means the nuclear rocket, with its lightweight, high-velocity exhaust, will use propellant about twice as efficiently as chemical rockets. This, then, is the principal advantage of nuclear propulsion.
It was at the AEC's Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, high in the mountains of New Mexico, that the first steps were taken. Here, in the mid-1950s, scientists set about to determine if nuclear energy really could be used to provide rocket propulsion. Theoretical studies and early experimental work revealed many problems that would have to be solved. Problems in reactor design, material, radiation, structures, control, to name but a few. The nuclear rocket was found to be feasible. A series of experimental reactors was planned to convert theory into workable hardware. Optimum reactor designs were worked out by analysis. Prototypes were built. A comprehensive test program was started. These reactors, called Kiwi, were to be used to prove out design and operational concepts. They would be built only for ground testing. All Kiwi power tests took place at the Nuclear Rocket Development Station at Jackass Flats, Nevada. Here in the desert, scientists and engineers checked the actual performance at various power levels and for various time periods. Each experimental Kiwi reactor was received in sections, assembled and checked out in a special reactor maintenance, assembly, and disassembly building called simply RMAD. When the reactor was ready for testing, it was placed nozzle up on a special rail car and delivered to the test stand a mile or so away. This car could be controlled from a remote station. Liquid hydrogen from nearby storage tanks was pumped through the reactor. First tests were begun in 1959 and were run to the 100 megawatt level, about 1/10 of Kiwi's ultimate goal of 1,000 megawatts. Later tests, beginning in 1962, operated at the full 1,000 megawatts. Films of these early tests show the flaming torch on the test stand that burns off the hydrogen exhaust gas and prevents an explosion hazard to the test facilities. Upon completion of these tests, each reactor, by then radioactive, was transported by remote control back to the RMAD building for disassembly and inspection. Here, men working behind shielded walls used remote-controlled manipulators to remove the components for careful checking and analysis. Each test firing added information that helped scientists evaluate the reactor's performance and enabled them to make adjustments and corrections before the next reactor was assembled. But not all tests showed perfect performance. In this one, for example, the flashing in the exhaust gas indicated a structural breakup caused by excessive vibration. Extensive redesign and testing were needed to correct the flaw. And in this test, a hydrogen leak caused a fire on the test stand. Again, a correction was made. Each test brought the scientists a little closer to the performance they were seeking. Until finally, in September 1964, the 8th Kiwi reactor was brought up to full power and held for 8 minutes. And a few weeks later, it was restarted and operated at full power for 2.5 minutes. Specific impulse, about 750 seconds. This concluded the Kiwi test series. It had proved that a nuclear reactor could be built that would power a spacecraft.
The next step, already underway, was to develop complete engine technology. This project was called NERVA, Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Applications. It was to be a combined industry-government effort headed by the Space Nuclear Propulsion Office, a joint NASA and Atomic Energy Commission activity. The principal contractors were to be Aerojet General Corporation and Westinghouse Astronuclear Laboratory. The NERVA technology reactor, given the letter designation NRX, was essentially the same as Kiwi, but now the contractors had to extend its lifetime and put it into an engine configuration. Here is how the nuclear rocket engine will work. The reactor is a solid core, heat exchange type, cylindrical in shape. Fission of uranium atoms in the core is the source of heat. A reflector made of beryllium surrounds the core. The core consists of many graphite elements impregnated with the uranium-235 fuel. The core contains a number of channels running down its length. Hydrogen passing through the channels picks up heat generated by the fission process. The channels are coated with niobium carbide, a material which resists the corrosion that would occur if the hot hydrogen were allowed to come into direct contact with the hot graphite. The hydrogen is stored in a liquid state to achieve the lowest possible volume. The flight model will use about 1/3 of a million gallons for a 30-minute firing. To start the engine, the cold liquid hydrogen at -420 degrees Fahrenheit moves through a pump down to the nozzle, through internal passages in the nozzle walls, and back up inside the reactor pressure shell and reflector. This cools the nozzle, the reactor shell, and the reflector, and at the same time warms the hydrogen. The hydrogen then passes through the hot fuel elements where it is heated to about 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. From there it is expanded through the nozzle to provide thrust. The bleed line carries some of the hot hydrogen back to drive the turbo pump. The whole engine system is amazingly compact for a nuclear power source. The reactor works through fission of uranium-235, which constantly emits nuclear particles called neutrons. When reflected back toward the reactor, these particles will set up a chain reaction, generating terrific heat. The heat is controlled by rotating rods installed in the beryllium reflector around the reactor. The rods are also made of beryllium, but one side is coated with boron, which absorbs neutrons. Initially, the rods are turned so the boron side is toward the fuel elements, and sufficient neutrons are absorbed to prevent nuclear fission from starting. Beryllium reflects neutrons. By turning the beryllium side toward the elements, a point is reached where sufficient neutrons are reflected for fission to begin. The amount of heat produced depends upon the position of the rods. Heat increases as more of the beryllium side turns toward the core. When the desired rate of heat production is reached, the rods are turned back to stabilize it. Heat decreases as the rods are turned back. When the boron side absorbs enough neutrons to halt the fission process, heat is no longer generated. These rods can be operated by remote control.
Test facilities for engine components were built near Sacramento, California. The problem? Get adequate performance with minimum weight. The pump must move huge quantities of liquid hydrogen under pressure at minus 420 degrees Fahrenheit, while the hydrogen-cooled nozzle must expand high-pressure gaseous hydrogen at 4,000 degrees to low pressure. The reactor was designed to meet the structural requirements of ground handling, launch, and spaceflight. In a late 1965 test, it operated intermittently for an hour, including 16 minutes at full power. But in that test, as in all reactor tests before it, the hydrogen had been forced through the reactor by test stand pumping facilities instead of its own turbine-driven pump. In early 1966, the new technology reactor and the chief engine components, including the turbo pump, were assembled for test. It was called a breadboard because they were not arranged as they would be in an actual engine. It would be the first self-starting test, and it was a vital step in the nuclear propulsion concept. This engine test model started perfectly and increased to full power, proving that a nuclear rocket could be started by its own pump. During a 2-month period, it was started and stopped 10 times and operated at different power levels for a total of 110 minutes, 28 minutes at full power. Technology had now advanced to the point where performance limits could be extended. Work was already underway to increase reactor power and operating time. In February 1967, this reactor, the Phoebus 1B, was operated at a power level roughly equivalent to 75,000 pounds of thrust. And in December 1967, this reactor, the NRX A6, was operated at full power for an hour. Also in 1967, a new test stand was completed that would permit a test engine to be fired nozzle down into a vacuum chamber below, at least partially simulating the space environment. In early 1968, the first ground test engine was mounted in the new stand. Its success was a new milestone along the long road leading to a flight engine. Heavy shielding was used in this test engine to protect some of the components from intense radiation. In flight engines, all components will be radiation hardened and less shielding will be needed. These tests will complete the technology for a nuclear rocket engine for application to space missions of the late 1970s and beyond. Its thrust will be approximately 75,000 pounds. For missions that require higher thrust, 2 or more of these engines may be used in a single stage, or several engine stages may be assembled side by side. This versatility will give us the capability to perform a variety of advanced missions.
Someday, a manned trip to Mars and return may become the mission assignment. Exactly how it would be carried out depends upon a number of factors, but here is one way it might be done with nuclear rocket propulsion. using the technology developed for earlier missions. Using several Saturn V launch vehicles, components of the huge spacecraft would be placed into Earth orbit and assembled. Separate nuclear stages might be provided for each major step of the mission. The first stage might consist of 3 clustered rockets for departure from Earth orbit. 2 other nuclear stages consisting of 1 engine each would be used in the vicinity of Mars. The first stage cluster fires to accelerate the spacecraft to the velocity needed to get to Mars in the time that was decided upon, say 200 days. At burnout, the first stage cluster is jettisoned and goes into orbit around the Sun. Mid-course correction is made by chemical rockets. About 200 days later, the space vehicle approaches Mars. There it is slowed down by a single nuclear rocket and enters an orbit around the planet. The used second stage is put into a higher Mars orbit than the space vehicle. A chemically powered module departs for the planet's surface. For the first time, men from Earth will set foot on another planet. For the return trip, the module is lifted by chemical power back into a Mars orbit, where it docks with the main space vehicle. The men transfer to the main craft and jettison the module, leaving it in an orbit around Mars. A third nuclear rocket accelerates the vehicle for the return trip. And it is jettisoned. Again, mid-course correction is made chemically. Just before reaching the vicinity of Earth, the crew transfers to a re-entry vehicle and jettisons the large spacecraft. Chemical rockets slow down the vehicle to re-entry speed, and they are jettisoned. After deceleration through the atmosphere, the re-entry vehicle returns to the Earth's surface by parachute. A trip to Mars and back, for centuries a dream of earthbound men, is now much closer to reality. Of course, there are many, many other problems to be solved before such advanced space missions can be attempted. Life support systems for extended space journeys, more accurate space navigation, communication systems, power supplies, and so forth. But any successful advanced mission must begin with propulsion, the power to get there and back. Lower overall weight, larger payloads, shorter travel time. These are the chief advantages of nuclear propulsion. The technology needed to build a nuclear rocket is well advanced. It will be available when this nation determines its next great objective in space.